Section 39 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Gareth Rowlands. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8, Section 39, Celtic Literature by William Sharp and Ernest Rhys. Section 2, Scottish. Early Celtic literature in Scotland is so intimately allied with the Irish that much of the previous section must be held to belong as much to the present one. We shall not need to recapitulate here what is there dealt with. The two Gaelic currents began to separate, if almost imperceptibly even then, and only in century-long stages after passing the point marked by the medieval recapitulators of Ossian and St. Patrick. How closely intermingled these currents were up to that point may be learned from the evidence of such exquisite lines as those preserved by the Scottish Dean MacGregor, entitled Ossian Song. Sweet is the voice of the land of gold, and sweeter the music of birds that soar, when the cry of the heron is heard on the wold, and the waves break softly on Bunda Tror. Down floats on the murmuring of the breeze the call of the cuckoo from Cossahoon. The blackbird is warbling among the trees, and soft is the kiss of the warming sun. The cry of the eagle in Assaroa or the court of Macmorn to me is sweet, and sweet is the cry of the bird below where the waves and the wind and the tall cliff meet. Finn MacCool is the father of me, whom 7 battalions of Fenians fear. When he launches his hounds on the open lea, grand is their cry as they rouse the deer. The last verse is eloquent as to the common tradition of the Scots and Irish Gael. Ossian is dealt with separately under his own proper heading, however, and we need not discuss here his interest, literary and historical. Turning to St. Patrick, let us accept provisionally the account that makes him of Gaelo-Brythonic race, born about 387 AD at Kilpatrick on the Clyde, Strathclyde being an old famous region of the northern Brythonic stock. The remains in prose and verse of the early Scottish literature dealing with St. Patrick are of course not so numerous as the Irish, but as the two were freely interchangeable, Reader's note, footnote A follows at the end of the paragraph. But as the two were freely interchangeable in the early period when his record was being written down, it follows that where Irish memoranda of his true and his legendary history, his hymns and so forth, existed, the Scottish chroniclers and bards would accept them without feeling the need of making a separate record. Nor must we forget, in speaking of St. Patrick, that the pre-Christian romantic mythology, with its firbolgs and ancient heroic gods, giants, and men, is just as much to be limned into the background of the picture in the case of early Scottish as in that of Irish Gaelic tradition and its earliest scriptive forms. Footnote A. The early literature of the Scottish Gael, says the Reverend Nigel MacNeill in his interesting work, The Literature of the Highlanders, cannot be well understood apart from early Irish literature. The ballads of the two countries describe the same struggles, the characters engaging in the strife are the same and bear the same names. End of footnote A. Curiously enough, if Scotland gave Ireland the saint that in course of time became almost its national symbol, Patrick, Ireland in turn gave Scotland its dearest saint, Columba. He was born in 521 near Temple Douglas, Tulach du Glais. In 545 founded a church in Derry, later the famous church at Kells, and in 563, after some jealousy had been at work against him, he left for Ireland, and after pausing at Columcille, he went on to Aya, now known the world over as Iona. Iona has become now the locus classici of the Gaelic, not to say the whole Scottish race. Recently, a writer of profound imagination, Miss Fiona Macleod, has dated from its lonely shores the dedication of that impressive book, The Sin Eater and Other Tales, showing how it still keeps for those of the true faith its old effect. Imocríde, imocraide, Isle of my heart, Isle of my love, as Columba is said to have called it. His followers, the little sacred circle of 12, the family of Iona, had to be militant with a vengeance, Milesian or soldiering as well as cleric in their work, and the old traditions are full of references to their fight against the Feen and the House of Ossian. But having so far prevailed as they did, they became in turn the chroniclers of the very thing they had fought against. And so, in a sense, and a very real one, Iona is the first centre of the literature of the Scottish Gael to which we can point. The total effect of Columba or Columcille upon Gaelic life and literature, Irish and Scots, was immense indeed, to gather whose force one must read in the Book of Deer and the old Irish manuscripts on the one hand, and the Latin hymnology of the Celtic Church on the other. But in speaking of Columba, let us not forget the tender and beautiful figure of St. Bridget, another of that mysterious train, including Merlin and St. Patrick, which has associations with Strathclyde. Bonny sweet bridie of the yellow, yellow hair. St. Bridget, the St. Mary of the Gael, whose story has been retold by Miss Fiona Macleod in The Washer of the Ford, may first be found depicted by the side of Patrick and Columba in the famous antique relic, the Domnach Airgid, dating back to the 6th or 7th century. She appears constantly in Gaelic hagiology, and with poetic as well as saintly fame, casting a halo about her yellow hair. O'Curry's manuscript materials and other collections make it possible, luckily, for those other than purely Gaelic students to read of her as she appeared in early time. She is a peculiarly interesting figure because in the Celtic races women have always counted peculiarly, and there are signs that they will count even more so in time to come. St. Bridget, Brigit, bride, breed, then, is the type for all time of the Celtic womanhood dowered with divine inspiration, poetry, and charm. The following variant on an old Gaelic poem is by Miss Fiona Macleod, from the Hills of Dream. St. Bridget's Milking Song. O sweet Saint Bride of the yellow, yellow hair, Paul said, and Peter said, and all the saints alive or dead vowed she had the sweetest head, bonny sweet bride of the yellow, yellow hair. White may my milking be, white as thee. Thy face is white, thy neck is white, thy hands are white, thy feet are white, for thy sweet soul is shining bright. O dear to me, O dear to see, Saint Bridget white. Yellow may my butter be, soft and round, thy breasts are sweet, soft, round, and sweet. So may my butter be, so may my butter be, O Bridget sweet. Safe the way is, safe, oh safe, Saint Bride, may my kye come home at even, none be fallen, none be leaving. Dusky even, breath sweet even, here as there, where, O Saint Bride, thou keepest tryst with God in heaven, seest the angels bow and souls be shriven. Here as there, 'tis breath sweet even, far and wide, singeth the little maid, safe in thy shade, Bridget, bride. Passing from the early legendary hagiological chronicles of the Scots Gaels, we come to a period when the reader must be content to go again to Irish sources for his knowledge of the continuators of Gaelic literature. What we have said previously of the Irish may be referred to here. The medieval scribes and bards busied themselves mainly with reproducing the past, though with a vivid colouring out of their own living present. When we have referred all of their subject matter dealing with the saints and heroic figures of primitive history to its own period, all that remains is curiously little. Unfortunately, it is less than it might have been if it had not been for the terrible and often wanton destruction of manuscripts, which has bereft us, in Scotland especially, of some of the richest treasures the Celtic genius has produced. It is only needed to instance the tailor who was found cutting up an ancient manuscript for patterns to show how almost inconceivably wholesale the havoc thus done has been in the last 6 centuries. Some of the most interesting and valuable of the Scottish contributions to Gaelic literature are in what we may call ballad form. Such is the tragic tale of Deirdre in the Glen Mason manuscript, 13th century, which is preserved in the Advocates' Library, Edinburgh. Others again are versions of poems correspondent to those given, for instance, in the Book of the Dean of Lismore. Of this heroic poetry much would have been lost if it had not been for the zeal of collectors who for the last 5 centuries have been collecting in old manuscripts, or from the mouths of the Highlanders, the ballads and tales of old time. The last and greatest of the ballad and tale collectors, says Mr. MacNeill, was Mr. Campbell, who in 1859-60 traversed the whole Gaelic area and, assisted by intelligent Highlanders, formed large collections, of which he has given a considerable quantity to the world in his 4 volumes of tales. All these are genuine productions. We may quote further what the same writer says of the uncertain chronology of these ballads. They may have been composed centuries before they were committed to writing. We have fragments, such as the Glen Mason manuscripts, written as early as the 12th century, in the hand and language common to the learned in both Albin and Erin at the time. The Book of the Dean of Lismore, however, is written phonetically to represent the spoken language of his day, and is mainly in the Perthshire dialect. Cuchulainn and many other of the heroes that we mentioned in our Irish article reappear in these ballads, and in them the Fine fight out their ancient battles to the bitter end. A new and rather different colouring is lent, too, to the Scottish ballads by the Norse element, and the constant wars in which the Vikings and the Gaels encountered time after time lend some of their finest episodes to this poetry. If we turn from the ballads to the prose tales and romances, we find the same strong resemblances and the same significant differences. The Irish have always the more fluent and eloquent faculty in prose and verse. Their adjectival energy is greater. They are more given to extravagances of style, both in point of sentiment and of humour. The Scotch are, on the other hand, more simple and more terse, and they touch the deeper notes of pathos and of mystery more often. Nothing more instructive can be devised for the Celtic student than to take the volumes in verse and prose represented by the 3 Celtic lands, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and to compare their style, method, and literary idiosyncrasies. For this comparison, Mr. Campbell's wonderful Tales of the West Highlands in prose, and in verse his Levar na Fine, may be cited, with works of Dr. Hyde, Mr. Standish Hayes O'Grady, Dr. Joyce in Irish, and in Welsh the Mabinogion in Lady Guest's exquisite English version, or the Myvyrian Archaeology. In the 14th century, which gave Dafydd ap Gwilym to Wales, we find Gaelic becoming more definitely a conscious literary language. But the Dafydd of Scotland came more than a century earlier, being born at the end of the 12th century. This was the famous Muireadach Albanach, Murdoch the Scot, several of whose poems figure in the Dean of Lismore's book, and whose effect on succeeding bards was only less powerful than Dafydd's on his Welsh successors. The Dean's book has poems too by 2 women poets, Efric, wife of the last of the famous MacNeills of Castle Sween, and Isabel, Countess of Argyll. Efric's lament for her husband contains some touching lines. Example: "There's no heart among our women, at the sport no man is seen, like the sky when windless silent is the music of Dunsween." Sir Duncan Campbell, Duncan MacCallum, the Good Knight, son of Sir Colin, is another of the poets in Dean MacGregor's collection, but perhaps we ought to pause here to say a word of the Dean himself. Sailing in among the inner Hebridean Isles, says Mr. MacNeill, we find in the fertile island of Lismore, the Great Garden, a man in the 15th century often referred to in Gaelic literature, the Reverend Mr. James MacGregor. A native of Perthshire, With a heart filled with the enthusiasm and perfervid spirit of his countrymen, he and his brother got up the collection of songs and ballads to which we have had occasion so often to refer. But we must pass on now to the later period of Gaelic literature, in which the modern developments have their beginning. The Scots Gael entered on a new phase, we are told, with Mary MacLeod, Mary Nín Alistair Rhys, who was born at Harris in 1569 and died a centenarian in Skye in 1674. Mary was as perfect an example of the folk minstrel as Celtic literature can provide, for she could not even write, although her prosody is elaborate and her metres often intricate and original to a degree. The first of the distinctly Jacobite bards, who flourished at the end of the 17th and through the 18th century, was John MacDonald, whose Battle of Inverlochy has been vigorously translated by Professor Blackie. Hector Maclean, Roderick Morrison, called An Clarser Dall, or the Blind Harper, John Maclean, whose songs were heard by Dr. Samuel Johnson and Boswell on their journey to the Hebrides, and John MacCodrum, a poet whose wit and satiric powers remind us not a little of more than one of the Welsh satirical bards, are among the poets of this time who specially deserve note. In the 18th century, Gaelic Scotland produced some remarkable religious poets, including David MacKellar, author of the well-known Mackellar's Hymn, John Mackay, Donal Matheson, who had satirical as well as religious power, Lachlan MacLachlan, and Dugald Buchanan. The great link between the 18th and the 19th centuries is Duncan Ban Macintyre, a name loved throughout the Highlands and Islands. The hunter bard of Glenorchy, as he is often called, though his best title is the affectionate Gaelic Duncan of the Songs, was born on the 20th of March 1724 at Druimlachart in Glenorchy, Argyll. His first song was composed on a sword with which he was armed at the Battle of Falkirk, where he served on the royalist side as substitute for a neighbouring gentleman. This sword, says his biographer, Thomas Paddison, the poet lost or threw away in the retreat. On his return home, therefore, the gentleman to whom it belonged, and whose substitute he had been, refused to pay the sum for which he had engaged Duncan Ban to serve in his stead. Duncan consequently composed his song on the Battle of the Speckled Kirk, as Falkirk is called in Gaelic, in which he good-humouredly satirises the gentleman who had sent him to the war, and gives a woeful description of the black sword that worked the turmoil, and whose loss, he says, made its owner as fierce and furious as a grey brock in his den. The song immediately became popular, and incensed his employer so much that he suddenly fell upon the poor poet one day with his walking-stick, and, striking him on the back, bade him go and make a song about that. He was, however, afterwards compelled by the Earl of Breadalbane to pay the bard the sum of 300 marks Scots, £16, 17 shillings and sixpence, which was his legal due. Duncan ended his days in Edinburgh, where he died in 1812, one of the last links of the moving record of the early 18th century and its Jacobite associations. Duncan was a contemporary of Macpherson's, and with Macpherson and his Ossian, to which a special article is devoted elsewhere, we may well leave our chronicle, forbearing to touch on the debatable ground of later and contemporary Celtic literature in Scotland. Enough to say that Duncan Ban Macintyre has no lack of worthy followers in Gaelic poetry, and that with the Anglo-Celtic development, associated with such names as Dr. Norman MacLeod, Professor Blackie, Robert Buchanan, George MacDonald, William Black, and, among newcomers, Miss Fiona MacLeod and Mr. Neil Munro, there seems every prospect that the Gaelic spirit promises to achieve greatly in the new centuries to come. The first selection is from the Sean Dana, or Ancient Poems, collected, or rather written, from oral legendary law and ballads, by Dr. John Smith, late in the 18th century. Prologue to Gaul. How mournful is the silence of night when she pours her dark clouds over the valleys! Sleep has overcome the youth of the chase. He slumbers on the hearth and his dog at his knees. The children of the mountain he pursues in his dream, while sleep forsakes him. Slumber, ye children of fatigue! Star after star is now ascending the height. Slumber, thou swift dog and nimble! Ossian will not arouse thee from thy repose. Lonely I keep watch, and dear to me is the gloom of night when I travel from glen to glen, with no hope to behold a morning or brightness. Spare thy light, O sun! Waste not thy lamps so fast. Generous is thy soul as the king of Morven's, but thy renown shall yet fade. Spare thy lamps of 1,000 flames in thy blue hall, when thou retirest under thy dark blue gates to sleep beneath the dark embraces of the storm. Spare them ere thou art forsaken for ever, as I am, without one whom I may love. Spare them, for there is not a hero now to behold the blue flames of the beautiful lamps. Ah, Cona of the precious lights, thy lamps burn dimly now. Thou art like a blasted oak. Thy dwellings and thy people are gone, east or west. On the face of thy mountain there shall be no more found of them but the trace. In Selma, Tara, or Temora, there is not a song, a shell, or a harp. They have all become green mounds. Their stones have fallen into their own meadows. The stranger from the deep or the desert will never behold them rise above the clouds. And, O Selma, home of my delight, is this heap my ruin, where grows the thistle, the heather, and the wild grass? The following lines of St. Columba are taken from the Lyra Celtica, cited above. Colum Sila fecit. St. Columba made it. Delightful would it be to me to be in Ucht Eilun, on the pinnacle of a rock, that I might often see the face of the ocean, that I might see its heaving waves over the wide ocean, when they chant music to their Father upon the world's course, that I might see its level sparkling strand, it would be no cause of sorrow, that I might hear the song of the wonderful birds, source of happiness, that I might hear the thunder of the crowding waves upon the rocks, that I might hear the roar by the side of the church of the surrounding sea, that I might see its noble flocks over the watery ocean, that I might see the sea monsters, the greatest of all wonders, that I might see its ebb and flood in their career, that my mystical name might be, I say, Cúl Rhi Erin, back turned to Ireland, that contrition might come upon my heart upon looking at her, that I might bewail my evils all, though it were difficult to compute them, that I might bless the Lord who conserves all, heaven with its countless bright orders, land, strand, and flood, that I might search the books all that would be good for my soul, at times kneeling to beloved heaven, at times psalm singing, at times contemplating the King of heaven, holy the chief, at times at work without compulsion, this would be delightful, at times plucking dulsk from the rocks, at times at fishing, at times giving food to the poor, at times in a carcair, solitary cell. The best advice in the presence of God to me has often been vouchsafed. The King whose servant I am will not let anything deceive me. The third selection is an example of later Gaelic. This stirring Hebridean poem is sometimes spoken of as from the ancient Gaelic. Probable by this is meant merely Old Gaelic, medieval, or even later. The translation is by Mr. Thomas Pattison and is included in his Gaelic Bards. He has the following note upon it. This effusion, though in its original form it is only a kind of wild chant, almost indeed half prose, yet is the germ of the ballad. It occurs in many of the tales contained in that collection, the repository of old Gaelic lore, the popular tales of the West Highlands, sometimes more and sometimes less perfect. The original will be found in the second volume of the tales. The vigorous and elastic spirit that pervades these verses must have strung the heart of many a hardy mariner who loved to feel the fresh and briny breeze drive his snoring birlinn bounding like a living creature over the tumbling billows of the inland loch or the huge swell of the majestic main. In Hebrid Seas. We turned her prow into the sea, her stern into the shore, and first we raised the tall tough masts, and then the canvas hoar. Fast filled our towering cloud-like sails, for the wind came from the land, and such a wind as we might choose were the winds at our command. A breeze that rushing down the hill would strip the blooming heather, or rustling through the green-clad grove would whirl its leaves together. But when it seized the aged sow with the light locks of grey, it tore away its ancient root, and there the old trunk lay. It raised the thatch too from the roof, and scattered it along, then tossed and whirled it through the air, singing a pleasant song. It leaped the ruins on the land, though sire and son stood by, they could not help afford but gaze with wan and troubled eye. A flap, a flash, the green rolled dashed, and laughed against the red. Upon our boards, now here, now there, it knocked its foamy head. She could have split a slender straw, so clean and well she went, as still obedient to the helm, her stately course she bent. We watched the big beast eat the small beast nimbly fly, and listened to the ploughing eels, the seagulls clang on high. We had no other music to cheer us on our way, till round those sheltering hills we passed, and anchored in this bay. End of section 39. Section 40 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Gareth Rowlands. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8, Section 40, Celtic Literature, by William Sharp and Ernest Rhys. Section 3, Welsh. The laws governing the life of languages are as elusive as those that decide the fate of races and empires. Why is the Welsh tongue still alive and vigorous, and the Irish, Pace Dr. Douglas Hyde, moribund? It is a difficult question, but some light on it may be had by traversing the early history of Welsh literature. The like difficulty meets us in both Welsh and Irish, that of deciding how far the medieval scribes and scholars doctored the older material which fell into their hands. But in Welsh, the separation of the primitive from the medieval element is often even a more difficult task than in Irish. In sketching the early course of Welsh literature, we cannot do better than turn to the striking instance afforded by the name and fame of Merlin. In legendary Welsh history, Merlin appears under almost as many guises as he does in the pages of Malory's Morte d'Arthur. Merddin Emrys, Ambrosius, Merddin Sylvester, Merlin the Wild, Merddin ab Morvryn, or Merddin Caledonius. His name and fame vary according to the chronicler. Of these, Merlin the son of Morvryn, the most tangible in the list, was also known as Caledonius because the Cymry of the 6th century lived in that greater Wales which ranged as far north as the Caledonian forest. After the terrible battle of Arderydd, Merlin, having seen his kindred all but obliterated, was seized, tradition tells us, with a frenzy, and thereafter his bardic utterances assumed a more and more mystical and oracular form. This, added to his mysterious and magnetic personality and wildly impressive personal presence, may well have led on in process of time by gradual legendary accretions to the final conception of a Merlin miraculous, supernatural, demonic. However this may be, nothing can be more instructive than to compare the late Merlin with the early Merlin, and to trace his phases in Welsh folktale, and define his poetry finally in the pages of the Black Book of Carmarthen. The Black Book of Carmarthen, in its strikingly decorative black and red manuscript, makes a wonderful testament of old Welsh poetry. If we could solve all its problems and read all that is written between its lines, we should be very near the great secret of the Druidic religion and of Celtic mythology, as well as the secret of Merlin's actual and imaginary effect in Welsh literature. The Battle of Arderydd has been cited above as a determining event in Merlin's history. The opening poem in the Black Book of Carmarthen is a remarkable rhymed dialogue between Merlin and Taliesin, some of whose lines are extremely imaginative and touching in their archaic simplicity. Merlin begins, "How sad is Merlin now, how sad! Cedwyf and Cadfan, are they dead? The furious slaughter filled the field, and pierced was the Traroid shield." Taliesin replies, "His housefolk did not falter in the fight." So it goes on, telling of the battle and its consequences, until one reaches at the end that mysterious verse which haunts the imagination and the ear of the reader. Merlin again speaks. "70 chieftains were turned into spirits. In the wood of Celadon were they transformed." The wood of Celadon is the Caledonian forest. So far as these excerpts go, they might seem to be the writings of the real Merlin. There is internal evidence, however, that this poem, the much disputed poem of the apple trees, and others that follow it in the Black Book, were written not earlier than the 12th century. Stephens, usually an acute critic, imputes in his Literature of the Cymry these poems to Gwalchmai and other bards of later date. But even so, these poets evidently founded their poems upon earlier ones, traditionally handed on as Merlin's. From such later sources as the Myvyrian Archaeology, or Skene's 4 Ancient Books of Wales, or the admirable Oxford texts edited by Professor Rhys and Mr. Gwynogvyn Evans, one can rehabilitate at will the Merlin of the Black Book of Carmarthen, much as Villemark has done after a fashion quite his own. Enough will so be certainly discovered to outline a primitive Merlin, an original 6th century Merlin, under the impressive medieval robes of the Latin Welsh Romantic chroniclers and poets. Enough, too, will be made clear to show a basis of myth and prehistoric legend behind the remotest recorded name, time, or place that can be counted historical. The same is true of Taliesin, who appears, by the poetical remains attributed to him, some of them clearly medieval, others just as clearly primitive, even more interesting as a poet than Merlin. Just as there are several Merlins, however, there are 2 Taliesins. There is the 5th century Taliesin, and there is the pseudo-Taliesin of the 12th. Both are wonderful in their way, and one knows not which to admire most. Him who wrote the Battle of Gwynestrad, which is undoubtedly a primitive war song, or the medieval poet who chose to take the disguise of Taliesin, and taking too, probably, some of the traditional fragments of his early poetry, work them up afresh with curious medieval art and mystic imagination. For comparison, let us take an early and a late poem, commonly gathered, as in the Myvyrian Archaeology, under one head. Take first one of the later poems, the mystical Song to the Wind, which even in its English dress won Emerson's admiration, and which, if we allow for all differences between medieval and modern imagination, is as wonderful a poem of its kind as any literature is likely to afford. As it is given among our selections, it need not be quoted here. In point of time, it is usual to assign it, as Stephens does, to the 12th or 13th century. But it seems to me to bear traces again of being an older, more primitive poem, retouched, certainly, and probably reshaped by a 12th century poet. And now for a genuine Taliesin, or what at any rate many critics think to be genuine. This you may have in the famous Gwaith Gwenystrad, Battle of Gwenystrad, one of the most spirited war poems in existence, copied and recopied by a long succession of Cymric scribes, and which the writer came upon first in the manuscript collection of William Morris o Gaergybi and Môn, who flourished about 1758. Here are 4 lines of Morris's copy Literatim, which will give a better idea than any criticism of mine of the mingled realism and imagination of the poem. Yn rhws ryd gwelais y wir lledryddion, a'r ddillwng a rag blawt gofedon, ynynt tanc gan eithant gollidion, llaw yng nghroes gryd ygro granwynion. And here is a rough, vigorous translation of these lines from the same volume. In the pass of the fort have I seen men, dyed with red, who hurtled their arms. They fell to the ground together when the day was lost, their hands on the crucifix, and horror was in the pale face of the dead warriors. A succeeding line, a gwaiar a owglai ar ddillad, and the blood was tangled in their clothing, adds the last touch of dreadful sincerity to the account. And in other primitive poems that we may ascribe to Taliesin are effects as convincing and vivid. But we must leave Taliesin and his difficulties to sketch briefly the course of poetry between his actual date in early time and his poetic resurrection in the Middle Ages. Not so interesting poetically, but more important historically, is the next of the Welsh bards, Aneirin, who wrote the Gododin. This curious and interesting war poem tells of a foray made by the Ottadini, an early Cymric tribe, living in the greater Wales of their time on the Northumbrian coast. Mr. Stephens imagines Catraeth, which figures as a central scene of the action of the poem, to be Catterick in Yorkshire, and this we may provisionally accept. The Welshman went to Catraeth, and merry marched the host, but through drinking the grey mead the day was lost. The expedition was one of those which show the gradual cession of Greater Wales by the Welsh, and their retreat to the lesser Wales that is still theirs. We may pause here to remark that the bardic order was early constituted among the Welsh as among the Irish. In the laws of Hywel the Good, who flourished in the 10th century, we find very explicit provision made for the bard. In case of fighting, the bard shall play the monarchy of Britain before the battle. His land shall be free. He shall have a horse from the king. He shall have a harp from the king, and a gold ring from the queen when he is appointed. The harp he shall never part with. Unless, which is highly probable, we have lost some of the records of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, we have to conclude that Welsh poetry made small headway. The remarkable laws of Hywel are the monument of the 10th century. In the 11th we come upon the first signs of a revival in Meilir, who is historically interesting and in his last poems shows himself a true poet. In the 12th we have to mark a distinct further step in Gwalchmai, who is the first conscious poet of nature, and who may thus claim to be the founder of one of the finest traditions in all Welsh poetry. Following Gwalchmai comes the princely poet Hywel the Tall, son of Owen Gwynedd by an Irish lady, and who himself wore the crown of Gwynedd for a brief 2 years. He died in 1171 at 27 after a life of stormiest adventure, but in the intervals of battle he found time to write some of the loveliest love poems that all Welsh literature can boast. His death was lamented by Perev ab Cedwoi in a much less conventional and more moving tone than the official bards generally troubled to use for such elegies. A century or so later, and we find Llywarch ab Llywelyn, known as Prydydd y Moch, the poet of the pigs, writing a still finer and more ample lament on the last native prince of Wales, Llywelyn ab Gruffydd, Llywelyn Ewi Lliw Olaf, as he is still fondly called. These two laments may be taken as typical of a wide selection of Welsh poetry, dealing with the deaths of heroes and princes, and ranging in date from the 5th or 6th century to the 19th. Llywelyn the Last died in 1282, and thereafter began what has been well termed the Great Oppression, a Gorthrwm Mawr, by which Norman and Saxon combined to crush the language and expropriate the people of the country, with the result of calling up at last Owen Glendower's hot spirit to fight for the national cause. But it is remarkable that in this disastrous period arose some of the finest interpreters of her genius that the country was ever to find. Within its term were, without a doubt, carried to an approximate perfection those more native romances that we term Mabinogion, the most exquisite and exquisitely turned tales in point of art that the Celtic races have ever produced. The late Lady Charlotte Guest's edition of the Mabinogion serves very well to convey, in a translation of extreme felicity, to non-Celtic readers the art and spirit of these tales. But it must be kept in mind that all she gives are not strictly Mabinogion. Several of them are more properly to be called romances, as showing strong traces of Norman and French influence. The Mabinogi originally was a tale to be recited by a Mabinogi, i.e., a prentice to the bardic craft, who had not yet obtained his full degree, and with it the right of composing and reciting poetry. The idea which some critics have that the Mabinogion were boys' tales, or still worse, nursery tales, is quite wrong. Let us remember that such tales were the delight of most of the princely halls and winter hearths of medieval Wales, where they were recited after the great banquets and on feast nights to the most critical audience that could be afforded. The Dream of Rhonabwy, Culhwch and Olwen, and Math, son of Mathonwy, may be mentioned as among the tales of Lady Guest's volume which are most natively original, and we have chosen the portrait of Olwen from the second of these for our selections, to show the art and charm of the Welsh romancers in the Middle Ages. If the Mabinogion are fine as prose, we have an equally fine expression of this time in poetry, in the poems of Rhys Goch ab Rhicert, Rhys the Red, son of Rhicert, and the ever-delightful Dafydd ap Gwilym, who will be found treated separately. After Dafydd, Welsh poetry was to enter upon a new phase, not fortunate even in its immediate effects, disastrous in its ultimate ones. It was in the 14th century that Welsh prosody, always intricate, finally waxed proud, so to speak, of its complexity, and formed for itself a hidebound code which was to become the bugbear of Welsh poetry in the following centuries. To give any adequate account of its complexities of technique and the whole letter of its syntax would require a long and tedious treatise in itself. Enough to say that the underlying principle was that of what is termed in Welsh anghanedd, or consonance, by which rhymes within rhymes and echoes within echoes of certain dominant syllables were insisted upon arbitrarily until almost every word in every line was subject to a rigid and invincible rule. Art for art, insisted upon in this way, could only end in conventionalizing the very thing it was meant to assist. Poetry, too carefully nursed and housed, thus fell into a bad way. But luckily, meanwhile, a new literature was to begin for Wales along quite other lines with the Reformation. The translation of the Bible into Welsh by Bishop Morgan in the 16th century marks an epoch in the life of the Welsh people and their literature. Therewith, the history of the princes and the great lords ends, and the history of the people, and a people mainly peasant, let us remark, begins. Its profound moral force apart, and judged purely as a literary force, the Bible, admirably and idiomatically translated, had an incalculable effect. It set a fine and high and yet simple standard of prose, much as the English Bible does, and taught the possibilities of his tongue to the poorest Welsh peasant. One finds its influence strong in almost every prose work of any note published in the last 3 centuries, and in a great proportion of the poetry. It did more than anything of later times to save the language. And here is the simple explanation of the extraordinary difference between the fortunes of the Welsh and the Irish tongue. Wales, the Wales of the people, became profoundly impressed by the religious sentiment and the heroic and profound poetry of the Hebrews, and gained from them a new stimulus to express itself and its needs and aspirations in its own native way and in its own tongue. A characteristic expression of the homelier moral humour of the Welsh is to be had in the Canwyll y Cymru, Candle of Wales, by Rhys Pritchard, the famous Elizabethan vicar of Llandovery, which for 2 centuries was the most popular book in Wales after the Bible. Its simple rhymed didactics do not often rise into poetry, but they are full of human feeling, expressed in a terse and proverbial way with distinct individuality. The book easily leads one on to the very remarkable band of hymn writers, from Anne Griffiths to Williams Pontycillin, who have flourished in Wales. These, and some score beside, really rank by their imaginative fervour and inspiration as true poets. In quite another vein, but probably a very ancient and traditional one in Welsh, we have the homely interludes of Twm o'r Nant, who was born about 1750, of whose life George Borrow gives a very vigorous account in Wild Wales. A greater than Twm o'r Nant, and born a generation earlier, Gronw Owen, a man of the finest poetic genius, ought to have a special interest for American readers because he was practically exiled from his beloved Anglesey by the ungrateful church he served, and died poor and broken-hearted in New Brunswick about the year 1780. His Cywydd y Fari, Ode to the Day of Judgment, his touching lines to his little daughter Ellen, or his Hogarthian lines upon the London garret in which he lived for a time, may be cited as showing the various sides of his poetry, of which unluckily there are no adequate translations yet forthcoming. In prose, we must not omit to mention the Bardd Cwsg, the Sleeping Bard, of Ellis Wynne, a very imaginative and idiomatic prose epic in little, describing the bard's vision of a curiously Welsh inferno. Wynne's prose style is remarkably fine and pure, modelled on the best biblical standard of a Welsh without English admixture. Welsh prose has been admirably handled too by some of the divines who have flourished within the past 2 centuries, and who have not confined their eloquence to the pulpit. Even when the state church had no sympathy with the Welsh people and their language, many of its individual members did much to keep the spirit of literature alive, while the nonconformist ministers of Wales have always been vigorously and eminently devoted to the same cause. Under happier circumstances today, the latest expression of this vital persistence of the Welsh in the quest of spiritual ideals is the movement that has carried the new national university to completion and rallied the younger generation under the banner of Cymru Fydd, Young Wales. The songs of Ceiriog Hughes, the poems of Islwyn, the works of scholars like Professor John Rhys, Canon Sylvain Evans, and Mr. Gwenogfyn Evans, the ardent writing and editing of Mr. Owen M. Edwards in his innumerable magazines and other adventures, and the novels of Daniel Owen, these may be named as among the influences that count most to the Wales of the 19th century's end. Note: for citations from Welsh literature, see articles on Aneurin, Mabinogion, and Taliesin. The Breton branch of Celtic literature will be treated under the heading Villamark, the celebrated collector of Barzaz Brege. End of section 40.
Section 41 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. Section 41. Celtic Literature, by William Sharp and Ernest Rhys. Section 4. Cornish. The literature of a single county of England is not likely to be very extensive, and when that literature and its language died for good and all a century ago, it becomes still more limited. Until the reign of Henry VIII, though for some time English had been very generally spoken throughout the county, the old Celtic Cornish, holding a middle position, philologically as well as geographically, between Welsh and Breton, was the mother tongue of at any rate the peasantry as far east as the Tamar. The great ecclesiastical revolution of that period helped to destroy it. Neither prayer book nor Bible was translated into it, and though the ardently Catholic Cornish at first would have none of the former, saying that it was but like a Christmas game, they were overruled by the forcible argument of apostolic blows and knocks, and had to submit. Then the language receded rapidly. By the time of the Great Rebellion, Truro was its eastern limit. Early in the 18th century, only the two western claw-like promontories retained it, and though Dolly Pentreath, who died in 1778, was not really the last person who spoke it, it was dead before the present century was born. A few traditional sentences, the numerals up to 20, and some stray words lingered on until our own day. 20 years ago, the present writer took down a fair collection from the mouths of ancient mariners in Mount's Bay, and a few words are still mixed with the local dialect of English. But as a language, Cornish is dead, though its ghost still haunts its old dwelling in the names of villages, houses, woods, valleys, wells, and rocks, from Tamar to Penwith. As may be expected, a great proportion of the literature is in verse, and most of that is in dramatic form. So little is there that an exhaustive list of what survives is quite possible. It is as follows. 1. The Poem of the Passion. A versified account of the Passion of our Lord, recounting the events from Palm Sunday to Easter, with the addition of many legendary incidents from the Gospel of Nicodemus and other similar sources. The earliest manuscript, in the British Museum, is of the 15th century, which is probably the date of its composition. It has been twice printed, once by Davies Gilbert, with a translation by John Keigwin in 1826, and by Dr. Whitley Stokes in 1862. 2. The Ordinalia. 3 connected dramas, known collectively under this title. The first recounts the creation and the history of the world as far as Noah's flood. The second act of this gives the story of Moses and of David, and the building of Solomon's temple, ending with the curiously incongruous episode of the martyrdom of St. Maximilla, as a Christian, by the bishop placed in charge of the Temple of Solomon. The second play represents the life of our Lord from the temptation to the crucifixion, and this goes on without a break into the third play, which gives the story of the resurrection and ascension, and the legend of the death of Pilate. The connecting link between the three is the legend of the wood of the cross. This well-known story, most of which is interwoven with the whole trilogy, is as follows. Seth was sent by his dying father to beg the promised oil of mercy to save him. The angel who guarded paradise gave him 3 seeds, or according to the play, apple pips, and when he returned and found his father already dead, he placed them in Adam's mouth and buried him on Mount Moriah. In process of time, the 3 seeds grew into 3 trees, and from them Abraham gathered the wood for the sacrifice of Isaac, and Moses got his rod wherewith he smote the sea and the rock. Later the 3 trees, to symbolize the Trinity, grew into 1 tree, and David sat under it to bewail his sin. But Solomon cut it down to make a beam for the temple, and since it would in no wise fit into any place, he cast it out and set it as a bridge over Cedron. Later on he buried it, and from the place where it lay there sprang the healing spring of Bethesda, to the surface of which it miraculously floated up, and the Jews found it, and made of it the cross of Calvary. These plays were probably written in the 15th century, perhaps by one of the priests of Glasney College near Falmouth, and were acted with others that are now lost in the places called Plananguare, the plain of the play, of which several still remain. The Ordinalia were published with a translation by Edwin Norris in 1859. 3. The Creation of the World with Noah's Flood was a modernized version of the first act of the first of the Ordinalia trilogy. It was written by William Jordan of Helston in 1611, but the author has borrowed whole passages of considerable length from the older play. The language represents a later period of Cornish, and occasionally several lines of English are introduced. Perhaps by a natural Celtic antipathy to the Saxon, these are generally put into the mouth of Lucifer and his angels, who furnish a good deal of the comic part of the piece. This play was published by Davies Gilbert in 1827, and by Dr. Whitley Stokes in 1864. 4. The Life of St. Mariasek. This play, written in 1504, is perhaps the most interesting of the batch. The story, at least of the others, contains nothing very new to most people, but St. Mariasek, or Mariadoc, to give him his Breton name, the patron of Camborne, is not a well-known character, and his life, full as it is of allusions and incidents of a misty period of Cornish history, is most curious and interesting. It is not perhaps simplified by being mixed up in the wildest manner with the legend of Constantine and St. Sylvester, and the scenes shift about from Cornwall or Brittany to Rome, and from the 4th to the heaven knows what century, with bewildering frequency. There are also certain other legends interwoven with the story, and it seems probable that at least 3 plays have been, as Dr. Whitley Stokes expresses it, unskilfully pieced together. Yet there are many passages of considerable literary merit. The only existing manuscript of this play is in the Hangworth collection at Peniarth, and it was edited and translated by Dr. Stokes in 1872. 5. There were probably many other plays which have perished, but one other there certainly was, of which a fragment exists. What it was called or what it was about no one knows, but an actor in it, setting about to learn his own part in it, wrote that short piece of 36 lines on the back of a title deed of some land in the parish of St. Stephen, near Bodmin. The deed drifted eventually into the British Museum, and the present writer discovered the Cornish verses on it, not wholly by accident, about 19 years ago. The writing belongs to the latter part of the 14th century, and is therefore the earliest literary fragment of the language. 6. The rest of the literature of the Cornish language consists of a few songs, epigrams, mottos, proverbs, and the like, a short dissertation on the language, and the tale of John of Cianhur, a widely known folk tale. These are mostly in the latest form of Cornish, and are contained in the manuscript collection of William Gwavas, in the British Museum and in that of Dr. Borlase, until lately in the possession of his descendants. Most of them have been printed by Davies Gilbert, with the play of the Creation, by William Price in the Archaeologia Cornu Britannica in 1790, by Mr. W. C. Borlase in the Transactions of the Royal Institution of Cornwall, and in a fragmentary way in a few other places. They are mostly translations or adaptations from the English, but a few, such as the rather doggerel Pilchard fishing song, are originals. Lastly, in the Church of St. Paul, near Penzance, there is the one solitary epitaph in the language, written while it was still just alive, and perhaps the last composition in it. The versions given of these specimens of Cornish literature are founded on those of Dr. Whitley Stokes and Dr. E. Norris. The phraseology has been to some extent altered, but the renderings are almost all the same. From the Poem of the Passion, the Death of our Lord on the Cross. His pain was strong and sharp, so that he could not live, but must yield up his white soul, ever purely had he lived. And Christ prayed, as thus in many a place we read, My soul I do commend, O Lord, between thy hands. For weakly he breathed, being constrained, so that he could not rest. On nothing could he lean his head, for the garland that he wore. If he leaned to one side, for his shoulder it grieved him, and the tree did yet worse, if he set it backwards. Nor could he lean forward, for fear of being choked. Then was it, as we read in books, as it is written, For the birds to make their nests, places are prepared, but for Christ where he may lay his head, no place is found. But now must he needs leave his head to hang, for his blood was all gone from him, and he could not live. To the side of the mother that owned him, his head he would hold, and his soul went from him, with chilling shriek and shrill cry. Beside the cross of Jesus was a man hight Century, and when he saw the wondrous thing that happened at Christ's death, and how his soul he yielded against nature with a cry, he said without scorning, this truly was God's Son, and many were there with him that testimony bore. Now was it midday in the land, or later, as is written. Earthquake there was, and lightning, and darkness over all. The temple veil was rent in twain, and to the ground it fell, and likewise broken were the stones so strong and hard. Graves in many places were opened wide, and the bodies that were in them were raised up, and went straightway to the city, by many were they seen, to bear witness that it was God's Son that was slain. Water, earth, and fire, and wind, sun, moon, and stars likewise, at Christ's suffering death knew sorrow. Nature will cause, I trow, if the good Lord be pained, all his subjects, even saints, to be grieved for his pain. From Origo Mundi in the Ordinalia. Seth, being sent to fetch the oil of mercy from paradise for his dying father, comes to the guardian cherub. Cherubin. Seth, what is thine errand, that thou comest so far? Tell me anon. Seth. O angel, I will tell thee. My father is old and weary. He wishes no longer to live, and through me he prayed thee to tell the truth of the oil of mercy promised to him at the last day. Cherubin. Within the gate put thou thy head, and behold it all, nor fear whatever thou seest, and look on all sides, spy out every detail, search out everything carefully. Seth. Very gladly I will do it. I am glad to have permission, to know what is there, and tell it to my father. And he looks and turns round, saying, Fair field to behold is this, hapless he who lost the land. But for the tree I wonder greatly that it should be dry. But I trow that it went dry, and all was made bare for the sin which my father and mother sinned. Like the prints of their feet, they all became dry as herbs, alas, when the morsel was eaten. Cherubin. O Seth, thou art come within the gate of paradise. Tell me what thou sawest. Seth. All the beauty that I saw, tongue of man can never tell. Of good fruits and beauteous flowers, of minstrels and sweet song, a fountain bright as silver, and flowing from it 4 great streams, that there is a desire to gaze upon them. In it there is a tree, high and with many boughs, but they are bare and leafless. Bark there is none around it, from the stem to the head all its branches are bare. And below when I looked, I saw its roots even into hell descending, in the midst of great darkness, and its branches growing up, even to heaven high in light. And it was wholly without bark, both the head and the boughs. Cherubin. Look yet again within, and all else thou shalt see before thou come from it. Seth. I am happy to have leave. I will go to the gate at once, that I may see further good. He goes and looks and returns. Cherubin. Dost thou see more now than what there was just now? Seth. There is a serpent in the tree. Truly a hideous beast is he. Cherubin. Go yet the 3rd time to it, and look better at the tree. Look what you can see on it, besides roots and branches. Seth. Cherubin, angel of the God of grace, high in the branches of the tree I saw a new-born child, wrapped in swaddling clothes, and bound with bands. Cherubin. It was God's Son that thou sawest, like a child in swaddling clothes. He will redeem Adam thy father, with his flesh and blood likewise, when the time is come, and thy mother and all good people. He is the oil of mercy, which was promised to thy father. Through his death truly shall all the world be saved. End of section 41.
Section 42 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Peary. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. Section 42. Biographical Note on Cervantes, 1547 to 1616, by George Santayana. Cervantes is known to the world as the author of Don Quixote, and although his other works are numerous and creditable, and his pathetic life is carefully recorded, yet it is as the author of Don Quixote alone that he deserves to be generally known or considered. Had his wit not come by chance on the idea of the ingenious Hidalgo, Cervantes would never have attained his universal renown, even if his other works and the interest of his career should have sufficed to give him a place in the literary history of his country. Here, then, where our task is to present in miniature only what has the greatest and most universal value, we may treat our author as playwrights are advised to treat their heroes, saying of him only what is necessary to the understanding of the single action with which we are concerned. This single action is the writing of Don Quixote, and what we shall try to understand is what there was in the life and environment of Cervantes that enabled him to compose that great book, and that remained embedded in its characters, its episodes, and its moral. There was in vogue in the Spain of the 16th century a species of romance called books of chivalry. They were developments of the legends dealing with King Arthur and the knights of the Table Round, and their numerous descendants and emulators. These stories had appealed in the first place to what we should still think of as the spirit of chivalry. They were full of tourneys and single combats, desperate adventures, and romantic loves. The setting was in the same vague and wonderful region as the coast of Bohemia, where, to the known mountains, seas, and cities that have poetic names, was added a prodigious number of caverns, castles, islands, and forests of the romancer's invention. With time and popularity, this kind of story had naturally intensified its characteristics until it had reached the greatest extravagance and absurdity, and combined, in a way, the unreality of the fairy tale with the bombast of the melodrama. Cervantes had apparently read these books with avidity, and was not without a great sympathy with the kind of imagination they embodied. His own last and most carefully written book, The Travails of Persiles and Sigismunda, is in many respects an imitation of them. It abounds in savage islands, furious tyrants, prodigious feats of arms, disguised maidens whose discretion is as marvelous as their beauty, and happy deliverances from intricate and hopeless situations. His first book also, the Galatea, was an embodiment of a kind of pastoral idealism, sentimental verses being interspersed with euphuistic prose, the whole describing the lovelorn shepherds and heartless shepherdesses of Arcadia. But while these books, which were the author's favorites among his own works, expressed perhaps Cervantes' natural taste and ambition, the events of his life and the real bent of his talent, which in time he came himself to recognize, drove him to a very different sort of composition. His family was ancient but impoverished, and he was forced throughout his life to turn his hand to anything that could promise him a livelihood. His existence was a continuous series of experiments, vexations, and disappointments. He adopted at first the profession of arms, and followed his colors as a private soldier upon several foreign expeditions. He was long quartered in Italy. He fought at Lepanto against the Turks, where, among other wounds, he received one that maimed his left hand, to the greater glory, as he tells us, of his right. He was captured by Barbary pirates and remained for 5 years a slave in Algiers. He was ransomed and returned to Spain, only to find official favors and recognitions denied him. And finally, at the age of 37, he abandoned the army for literature. His first thought as a writer does not seem to have been to make direct use of his rich experience and varied observation. He was rather possessed by an obstinate longing for that poetic gift, which, as he confesses in one place, heaven had denied him. He began with the idyllic romance, the Galatea, already mentioned, and at various times during the rest of his life wrote poems, plays, and stories of a romantic and sentimental type. In the course of these labors, however, he struck one vein of much richer promise. It was what the Spanish call the picaresque, that is, the description of the life and character of rogues, pickpockets, vagabonds, and all those wretches and sorry wits that might be found about the highways, in the country inns, or in the slums of cities. Of this kind is much of what is best in his collected stories, the Novelas Exemplares. The talent and the experience which he betrays in these amusing narratives were to be invaluable to him later as the author of Don Quixote, where they enabled him to supply a foil to the fine world of his poor hero's imagination. We have now mentioned what were perhaps the chief elements of the preparation of Cervantes for his great task. They were a great familiarity with the romances of chivalry, and a natural liking for them, a life of honorable but unrewarded endeavor, both in war and in the higher literature, and much experience of vagabondia, with the art of taking down and reproducing in amusing profusion the typical scenes and languages of low life. Out of these elements, a single spark, which we may attribute to genius, to chance, or to inspiration, was enough to produce a new and happy conception, that of a parody on the romances of chivalry, in which the extravagances of the fables of knighthood should be contrasted with the sordid realities of life. This is done by the ingenious device of representing a country gentleman whose naturally generous mind, unhinged by much reading of the books of chivalry, should lead him to undertake the office of knight-errant, and induce him to ride about the country clad in ancient armor, to right wrongs, to succor defenseless maidens, to kill giants, and to win empires at least as vast as that of Alexander. This is the subject of Don Quixote. But, happy as the conception is, it could not have produced a book of enduring charm and well-seasoned wisdom had it not been filled in with a great number of amusing and lifelike episodes, and verified by two admirable figures, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, characters at once intimately individual and truly universal. Don Quixote at first appears to the reader, and probably appeared to the author as well, as primarily a madman, a thin and gaunt old village squire, whose brain has been turned by the nonsense he has read and taken for gospel truth, and who is punished for his ridiculous mania by an uninterrupted series of beatings, falls, indignities, and insults. But the hero and the author together, with the ingenuity proper to madness and the inevitableness proper to genius, soon begin to disclose the fund of intelligence and ideal passion which underlies this superficial insanity. We see that Don Quixote is only mad north-northwest when the wind blows from the quarter of his chivalrous preoccupation. At other times he shows himself a man of great goodness and fineness of wit, virtuous, courageous, courteous, and generous, and in fact the perfect ideal of a gentleman. When he takes, for instance, a handful of acorns from the goatherd's table, and begins a grandiloquent discourse upon the golden age, we feel how cultivated the man is, how easily the little things of life suggest to him the great things, and with what delight he dwells on what is beautiful and happy. The truth and pathos of the character become all the more compelling when we consider how naturally the hero's madness and calamities flow from this same exquisite sense of what is good. The contrast to this figure is furnished by that of Sancho Panza, who embodies all that is matter-of-fact, gross, and plebeian. Yet he is willing to become Don Quixote's esquire, and by his credulity and devotion shows what an ascendancy a heroic and enthusiastic nature can gain over the most sluggish of men. Sancho has none of the instincts of his master. He never read the books of chivalry or desired to right the wrongs of the world. He is naturally satisfied with his crust and his onions, if they can be washed down with enough bad wine. His good drudge of a wife never transformed herself in his fancy into a peerless Dulcinea. Yet Sancho follows his master into every danger, shares his discomfiture and the many blows that rain down upon him, and hopes, to the end, for the governorship of that insula with which Don Quixote is some day to reward his faithful esquire. As the madness of Don Quixote is humanized by his natural intelligence and courage, so the grossness and credulity of Sancho are relieved by his homely wit. He abounds in proverbs. He never fails to see the reality of a situation and to protest doggedly against his master's visionary flights. He holds fast as long as he can to the evidence of his senses and to his little weaknesses of flesh and spirit. But finally he surrenders to the authority of Don Quixote and of the historians of chivalry, although not without a certain reluctance and some surviving doubts. The character of Sancho is admirable for the veracity with which its details are drawn. The traits of the boor, the glutton, and the coward come most naturally to the surface upon occasion, yet Sancho remains a patient, good-natured peasant, a devoted servant, and a humble Christian. Under the cover of such lifelike incongruities, and of a pervasive humor, the author has given us a satirical picture of human nature not inferior, perhaps, to that furnished by Don Quixote himself. For instance, Don Quixote, after mending his helmet, tries its strength with a blow that smashes it to pieces. He mends it a second time, but now, without trial, deputes it to be henceforth a strong and perfect helmet. Sancho, when he is sent to bear a letter to Dulcinea, neglects to deliver it, and invents an account of his interview with the imaginary lady for the satisfaction of his master. But before long, by dint of repeating the story, he comes himself to believe his own lies. Thus, self-deception in the knight is the ridiculous effect of courage, and in the esquire the not less ridiculous effect of sloth. The adventures these two heroes encounter are naturally only such as travelers along the Spanish roads would then have been likely to come upon. The point of the story depends on the familiarity and commonness of the situations in which Don Quixote finds himself, so that the absurdity of his pretensions may be overwhelmingly shown. Critics are agreed in blaming the exceptions which Cervantes allowed himself to make to the realism of his scenes, where he introduced romantic tales into the narrative of the first part. The tales are in themselves unworthy of their setting and contrary to the spirit of the whole book. Cervantes doubtless yielded here partly to his storytelling habits, partly to a fear of monotony in the uninterrupted description of Don Quixote's adventures. He avoided this mistake in the second part, and devised the visit to the Duke's palace and the intentional sport there made of the hero to give variety to the story. More variety and more unity may still perhaps seem desirable in the book. The episodes are strung together without much coherence and without any attempt to develop either the plot or the characters. Sancho, to be sure, at last tastes the governorship of his insula, and Don Quixote on his deathbed recovers his wits. But this conclusion, appropriate and touching as it is, might have come almost anywhere in the course of the story. The whole book has, in fact, rather the quality of an improvisation. The episodes suggest themselves to the author's fancy as he proceeds, a fact which gives them the same unexpectedness and sometimes the same incompleteness which the events of a journey naturally have. It is in the genius of this kind of narrative to be a sort of imaginary diary, without a general dramatic structure. The interest depends on the characters and the incidents alone, on the fertility of the author's invention, on the ingenuity of the turns he gives to the story, and on the incidental scenes and figures he describes. When we have once accepted this manner of writing fiction, which might be called that of the novelist before the days of the novel, we can only admire the execution of Don Quixote as masterly in its kind. We find here an abundance of fancy that is never at a loss for some probable and interesting incident. We find a graphic power that makes living and unforgettable many a minor character, even if slightly sketched. We find the charm of the country rendered by little touches, without any formal descriptions, and we find a humorous and minute reproduction of the manners of the time. All this is rendered in a flowing and easy style, abounding in both characterization and parody of diverse types of speech and composition, and the whole is still but the background for the figures of Don Quixote and Sancho, and for their pleasant discourse, the quality and savour of which is maintained to the end. These excellences unite to make the book one of the most permanently delightful in the world, as well as one of the most diverting. Seldom has laughter been so well justified as that which the reading of Don Quixote continually provokes. Seldom has it found its causes in such genuine fancy, such profound and real contrast, and such victorious good humour. We sometimes wish, perhaps, that our heroes were spared some of their bruises, and that we were not asked to delight so much in promiscuous beatings and floggings. But we must remember that these 300 years have made the European race much more sensitive to physical suffering. Our ancestors took that doubtful pleasure in the idea of corporal writhings which we still take in the description of the tortures of the spirit. The idea of both evils is naturally distasteful to a refined mind, but we admit more willingly the kind which habit has accustomed us to regard as inevitable, and which personal experience very probably has made an old friend. Don Quixote has accordingly enjoyed a universal popularity, and has had the singular privilege of accomplishing the object for which it was written, which was to recall fiction from the extravagances of the books of chivalry to the study of real life. This is the simple object which Cervantes had and avowed. He was a literary man with literary interests, and the idea which came to him was to ridicule the absurdities of the prevalent literary mode. The rich vein which he struck in the conception of Don Quixote's madness and topsy-turvy adventures encouraged him to go on. The subject and the characters deepened under his hands until, from a parody of a certain kind of romances, the story threatened to become a satire on human idealism. At the same time, Cervantes grew fond of his hero, and made him, as we must feel, in some sort a representative of his own chivalrous enthusiasms and constant disappointments. We need not, however, see in this transformation any deep-laid malice or remote significance. As the tale opened out before the author's fancy and enlisted his closer and more loving attention, he naturally enriched it with all the wealth of his experience. Just as he diversified it with pictures of common life and manners, so he weighted it with the burden of human tragedy. He left upon it an impress of his own nobility and misfortunes, side by side with a record of his time and country. But in this there was nothing intentional. He only spoke out of the fullness of his heart. The highest motives and characters had been revealed to him by his own impulses, and the lowest by his daily experience. There is nothing in the book that suggests a premeditated satire upon faith and enthusiasm in general. The author's evident purpose is to amuse, not to upbraid or to discourage. There is no bitterness in his pathos or despair in his disenchantment, partly because he retains a healthy fondness for this naughty world, and partly because his heart is profoundly and entirely Christian. He would have rejected with indignation an interpretation of his work that would see in it an attack on religion or even on chivalry. His birth and nurture had made him religious and chivalrous from the beginning, and he remained so by conviction to the end. He was still full of plans and hopes when death overtook him, but he greeted it with perfect simplicity, without lamentations over the past or anxiety for the future. If we could have asked Cervantes what the moral of Don Quixote was to his own mind, he would have told us, perhaps, that it was this: that the force of idealism is wasted when it does not recognize the reality of things. Neglect of the facts of daily life made the absurdity of the romances of chivalry and of the enterprise of Don Quixote. What is needed is not, of course, that idealism should be surrendered, either in literature or in life, but that in both it should be made efficacious by a better adjustment to the reality it would transform. Something of this kind would have been, we may believe, Cervantes' own reading of his parable. But when parables are such direct and full transcripts of life as is the story of Don Quixote, they offer almost as much occasion for diversity of interpretation as does the personal experience of men in the world. That the moral of Don Quixote should be doubtful, and that each man should be tempted to see in it the expression of his own convictions, is, after all, the greatest possible encomium of the book. For we may infer that the truth has been rendered in it, and that men may return to it always, as to nature herself, to renew their theories, or to forget them, and to refresh their fancy with the spectacle of a living world. End of section 42.
Section 43 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ron Altman. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8, Section 43. Selected Excerpts by Cervantes, Part 1, by George Santayana. Treating of the character and pursuits of Don Quixote. In a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind, there lived not long since one of those gentlemen that keep a lance in the lance-rack, and an old buckler, a lean hack, and a greyhound for coursing, an olla of rather more beef than mutton, a salad on most nights, scraps on Saturdays, lentils on Fridays, and a pigeon or so extra on Sundays, made away with 3/4 of his income. The rest of it went in a doublet of fine cloth and velvet breeches and shoes to match for holidays, while on weekdays he made a brave figure in his best homespun. He had in his house a housekeeper past 40, a niece under 20, and a lad for the field and market-place, who used to saddle the hack as well as handle the bill-hook. The age of this gentleman of ours was bordering on 50. He was of a hardy habit, spare, gaunt-featured, a very early riser, and a great sportsman. They will have it his surname was Quejada, or Quesada, for here there is some difference of opinion among the authors who write on the subject, although from reasonable conjectures it seems plain that he was called Quejana. This, however, is of but little importance to our tale. It will be enough not to stray a hair's breadth from the truth in the telling of it. You must know, then, that the above-named gentleman, whenever he was at leisure, which was mostly all the year round, gave himself up to reading books of chivalry with such ardor and avidity that he almost entirely neglected the pursuit of his field sports, and even the management of his property, and to such a pitch did his eagerness and infatuation go, that he sold many an acre of tillage land to buy books of chivalry to read, and brought home as many of them as he could get. But of all there were none he liked so well as those of the famous Feliciano de Silva's composition, for their lucidity of style and complicated conceits were as pearls in his sight, particularly when in his reading he came upon courtships and cartels, where he often found passages like, "The reason of the unreason with which my reason is afflicted, so weakens my reason that with reason I murmur at your beauty." Or again, "The high heavens that of your divinity divinely fortify you with the stars, render you deserving of the desert your greatness deserves." Over conceits of this sort the poor gentleman lost his wits, and used to lie awake striving to understand them and worm the meaning out of them. What Aristotle himself could not have made out or extracted, had he come to life again for that special purpose. He was not at all easy about the wounds which Don Belianis gave and took, because it seemed to him that, great as were the surgeons who had cured him, he must have had his face and body covered all over with seams and scars. He commended, however, the author's way of ending his book with the promise of that interminable adventure, and many a time was he tempted to take up his pen and finish it properly, as is there proposed, which no doubt he would have done, and made a successful piece of work of it too, had not greater and more absorbing thoughts prevented him. Many an argument did he have with the curate of his village, a learned man and a graduate of Sigenza, as to which had been the better knight, Palmerin of England or Amadis of Gaul. Master Nicholas, the village barber, however, used to say that neither of them came up to the Knight of Phoebus, and that if there was any could compare with him, it was Don Galaor, the brother of Amadis of Gaul, because he had a spirit that was equal to every occasion, and was no finikin knight, nor lachrymose like his brother, while in the matter of valor he was not a whit behind him. In short, he became so absorbed in his books that he spent his nights from sunset to sunrise, and his days from dawn to dark, poring over them, and what with little sleep and much reading, his brains got so dry that he lost his wits. His fancy grew full of what he used to read about in his books, enchantments, quarrels, battles, challenges, wounds, wooings, loves, agonies, and all sorts of impossible nonsense. And it so possessed his mind that the whole fabric of invention and fancy he read of was true, that to him no history in the world had more reality in it. He used to say the Cid Ruy Diaz was a very good knight, but that he was not to be compared with the knight of the burning sword, who with one backstroke cut in half two fierce and monstrous giants. He thought more of Bernardo del Carpio, because at Roncesvalles he slew Roland in spite of enchantments, availing himself of the artifice of Hercules when he strangled Antaeus, the son of Terra, in his arms. He approved highly of the giant Morgante, because, although of the giant breed, which is always arrogant and ill-conditioned, he alone was affable and well-bred. But above all, he admired Reinaldos of Montalban, especially when he saw him sallying forth from his castle and robbing everyone he met, and when beyond the seas he stole that image of Mahomet, which, as his history says, was entirely of gold. And to have a bout of kicking at that traitor of a Ganelon, he would have given his housekeeper and his niece into the bargain. In short, his wits being quite gone, he hit upon the strangest notion that ever madman in this world hit upon, and that was that he fancied it was right and requisite, as well for the support of his own honor as for the service of his country, that he should make a knight-errant of himself, roaming the world over in full armor and on horseback in quest of adventures, and putting in practice himself all that he had read of as being the usual practices of knights-errant, righting every kind of wrong, and exposing himself to peril and danger, from which in the issue he was to reap eternal renown and fame. Already the poor man saw himself crowned, by the might of his arm, Emperor of Trebizond at least, and so, led away by the intense enjoyment he found in these pleasant fancies, he set himself forthwith to put his scheme into execution. The first thing he did was to clean up some armor that had belonged to his great-grandfather, and had been for ages lying forgotten in a corner, eaten with rust and covered with mildew. He scoured and polished it as best he could, but he perceived one great defect in it, that it had no closed helmet, nothing but a simple morion. This deficiency, however, his ingenuity supplied, for he contrived a kind of half-helmet of pasteboard, which, fitted on to the morion, looked like a whole one. It is true that, in order to see if it was strong and fit to stand a cut, he drew his sword and gave it a couple of slashes, the first of which undid in an instant what had taken him a week to do. The ease with which he had knocked it to pieces disconcerted him somewhat, and to guard against that danger, he set to work again, fixing bars of iron on the inside until he was satisfied with its strength, and then, not caring to try any more experiments with it, he passed it and adopted it as a helmet of the most perfect construction. He next proceeded to inspect his hack, which, with more quartos than a reel and more blemishes than the steed of Gonella, that tantum pellicet osso fuit, surpassed in his eyes the Bucephalus of Alexander, or the Babica of the Cid. 4 days were spent in thinking what name to give him, because, as he said to himself, it was not right that a horse belonging to a knight so famous, and one with such merits of his own, should be without some distinctive name, and he strove to adapt it so as to indicate what he had been before belonging to a knight-errant, and what he then was, for it was only reasonable that his master, taking a new character, he should take a new name, and that it should be a distinguished and full-sounding one, befitting the new order and calling he was about to follow. And so, after having composed, struck out, rejected, added to, unmade, and remade a multitude of names out of his memory and fancy, he decided upon calling him Rosinante. To his thinking, lofty, sonorous, and significant of his condition as a hack before he became what he now was, the first and foremost of all the hacks in the world. Having got a name for his horse so much to his taste, he was anxious to get one for himself, and he was 8 days more pondering over this point, till at last he made up his mind to call himself Don Quixote, whence, as has already been said, the authors of this veracious history have inferred that his name must have been beyond a doubt Quixada, and not Quesada, as others would have it. Recollecting, however, that the valiant Amadis was not content to call himself curtly Amadis and nothing more, but added the name of his kingdom and country to make it famous, and called himself Amadis of Gaul, he, like a good knight, resolved to add on the name of his, and to style himself Don Quixote of La Mancha, whereby he considered he described accurately his origin and country, and did honor to it in taking his surname from it. So then, his armor being furbished, his morion turned into a helmet, his hack christened, and he himself confirmed, he came to the conclusion that nothing more was needed now but to look out for a lady to be in love with. For a knight-errant without love was like a tree without leaves or fruit, or a body without a soul. As he said to himself, "If for my sins or by my good fortune I come across some giant hereabouts, a common occurrence with knights-errant, and overthrow him in one onslaught, or cleave him asunder to the waist, or in short vanquish and subdue him, will it not be well to have someone I may send him to as a present, that he may come in and fall on his knees before my sweet lady, and in a humble, submissive voice say, 'I am the giant Caraculiambro, lord of the island of Malandrania, vanquished in single combat by the never sufficiently extolled knight, Don Quixote of La Mancha, who has commanded me to present myself before your grace, that your highness dispose of me at your pleasure.'" Oh, how our good gentleman enjoyed the delivery of this speech, especially when he had thought of someone to call his lady. There was, so the story goes, in a village near his own, a very good-looking farm girl, with whom he had been at one time in love, though so far as is known, she never knew it, nor gave a thought to the matter. Her name was Aldonza Lorenzo, and upon her he thought fit to confer the title of Lady of his Thoughts. And after some search for a name which should not be out of harmony with her own, and should suggest and indicate that of a princess and great lady, he decided upon calling her Dulcinea del Toboso, she being of El Toboso, a name, to his mind, musical, uncommon, and significant, like all those he had already bestowed upon himself and the things belonging to him. Of what happened to Don Quixote when he left the inn. Day was dawning when Don Quixote quitted the inn, so happy, so gay, so exhilarated at finding himself dubbed a knight, that his joy was like to burst his horse girths. However, recalling the advice of his host as to the requisites he ought to carry with him, especially that referring to money and shirts, he determined to go home and provide himself withal, and also with a squire, for he reckoned upon securing a farm labourer, a neighbour of his, a poor man with a family, but very well qualified for the office of squire to a knight. With this object he turned his horse's head towards his village, and Rosinante, thus reminded of his old quarters, stepped out so briskly that he hardly seemed to tread the earth. He had not gone far, when out of a thicket on his right there seemed to come feeble cries, as of someone in distress, and the instant he heard them he exclaimed, "Thanks be to heaven for the favour it accords me, that it so soon offers me an opportunity of fulfilling the obligation I have undertaken, and gathering the fruit of my ambition. These cries no doubt come from some man or woman in want of help, and needing my aid and protection." And wheeling, he turned Rosinante in the direction whence the cries seemed to proceed. He had gone but a few paces into the wood, when he saw a mare tied to an oak, and tied to another, and stripped from the waist upwards, a youth of about 15 years of age, from whom the cries came. Nor were they without cause, for a lusty farmer was flogging him with a belt, and following up every blow with scoldings and commands, repeating, "Your mouth shut and your eyes open," while the youth made answer, "I won't do it again, master mine. By God's passion, I won't do it again, and I'll take more care of the flock another time." Seeing what was going on, Don Quixote said in an angry voice, "Discourteous knight, it ill becomes you to assail one who cannot defend himself. Mount your steed and take your lance." For there was a lance leaning against the oak to which the mare was tied, "and I will make you know that you are behaving as a coward." The farmer, seeing before him this figure in full armour brandishing a lance over his head, gave himself up for dead, and made answer meekly, "Sir knight, this youth that I am chastising is my servant, employed by me to watch a flock of sheep that I have hard by, and he is so careless that I lose one every day, and when I punish him for his carelessness and knavery, he says I do it out of niggardliness, to escape paying him the wages I owe him, and before God and on my soul he lies." "Lies before me, base clown," said Don Quixote. "By the sun that shines on us, I have a mind to run you through with this lance. Pay him at once, without another word. If not, by the God that rules us, I will make an end of you, and annihilate you on the spot. Release him instantly." The farmer hung his head, and without a word untied his servant, of whom Don Quixote asked how much his master owed him. He replied, 9 months, at 7 reals a month. Don Quixote added it up, found that it came to 63 reals, and told the farmer to pay it down immediately if he did not want to die for it. The trembling clown replied that as he lived and by the oath he had sworn, though he had not sworn any, it was not so much, for there were to be taken into account and deducted 3 pairs of shoes he had given him, and a real for 2 bloodlettings when he was sick. "All that is very well," said Don Quixote, "but let the shoes and the bloodlettings stand as a set-off against the blows you have given him without any cause. For if he spoiled the leather of the shoes you paid for, you have damaged that of his body, and if the barber took blood from him when he was sick, you have drawn it when he was sound, so on that score he owes you nothing." "The difficulty is, Sir Knight, that I have no money here. Let Andres come home with me, and I will pay him all, real by real." "I go with him," said the youth. "Nay, God forbid! No, señor, not for the world, for once alone with me, he would flay me like a Saint Bartholomew." "He will do nothing of the kind," said Don Quixote. "I have only to command, and he will obey me, and he has sworn to me by the order of knighthood which he has received. I leave him free, and I guarantee the payment." "Consider what you are saying, señor," said the youth. "This master of mine is not a knight, nor has he received any order of knighthood, for he is Juan Haldudo the Rich of Quintanar." "That matters little," replied Don Quixote. "There may be Haldudo's knights. Moreover, every one is the son of his works." "That is true," said Andres. "But this master of mine, of what work is he the son, when he refuses me the wages of my sweat and labor?" "I do not refuse, brother Andres," said the farmer. "Be good enough to come along with me, and I swear by all the orders of knighthood there are in the world to pay you as I have agreed, real by real, and perfumed." "For the perfumery I excuse you," said Don Quixote. "Give it to him in reals, and I shall be satisfied. And see that you do as you have sworn. If not, by the same oath I swear to come back and hunt you out and punish you, and I shall find you though you should lie closer than a lizard. And if you desire to know who it is lays this command upon you, that you may be more firmly bound to obey it, know that I am the valorous Don Quixote of La Mancha, the undoer of wrongs and injustices. And so God be with you, and keep in mind what you have promised and sworn, under those penalties that have been already declared to you." So saying, he gave Rosinante the spur, and was soon out of reach. The farmer followed him with his eyes, and when he saw that he had cleared the wood and was no longer in sight, he turned to his boy Andres and said, "Come here, my son, I want to pay you what I owe you, as that undoer of wrongs has commanded me." "My oath on it," said Andres. "Your worship will be well advised to obey the command of that good knight. May he live 1,000 years, for as he is a valiant and just judge by rogue, if you do not pay me he will come back and do as he said." "My oath on it too," said the farmer. "But as I have a strong affection for you, I want to add to the debt in order to add to the payment." And seizing him by the arm, he tied him up to the oak again, where he gave him such a flogging that he left him for dead. "Now, Master Andres," said the farmer, "call on the undoer of wrongs. You will find he won't undo that, though I am not sure that I have quite done with you, for I have a good mind to flay you alive as you feared." But at last he untied him, and gave him leave to go look for his judge in order to put the sentence pronounced into execution. Andres went off rather down in the mouth, swearing he would go to look for the valiant Don Quixote of La Mancha, and tell him exactly what had happened, and that all would have to be repaid him sevenfold. But for all that, he went off weeping, while his master stood laughing. Thus did the valiant Don Quixote right that wrong, and thoroughly satisfied with what had taken place, as he considered he had made a very happy and noble beginning with his knighthood, he took the road towards his village in perfect self-content, saying in a low voice, "Well, mayest then this day call thyself fortunate above all on earth, O Dulcinea del Toboso, fairest of the fair, since it has fallen to thy lot to hold subject and submissive to thy full will and pleasure a knight so renowned as is and will be Don Quixote of La Mancha, who, as all the world knows, yesterday received the order of knighthood, and hath today righted the greatest wrong and grievance that ever injustice conceived and cruelty perpetrated, who hath today plucked the rod from the hand of yonder ruthless oppressor so wantonly lashing that tender child." He now came to a road branching in 4 directions, and immediately he was reminded of those crossroads where knights-errant used to stop to consider which road they should take. In imitation of them, he halted for a while, and after having deeply considered it, he gave Rosinante his head, submitting his own will to that of his hack, who followed out his first intention, which was to make straight for his own stable. After he had gone about 2 miles, Don Quixote perceived a large party of people, who, as afterwards appeared, were some Toledo traders, on their way to buy silk at Murcia. There were 6 of them coming along under their sunshades, with 4 servants mounted, and 3 muleteers on foot. Scarcely had Don Quixote descried them when the fancy possessed him that this must be some new adventure, and to help him to imitate as far as he could those passages he had read of in his books, here seemed to come one made on purpose, which he resolved to attempt. So, with a lofty bearing and determination, he fixed himself firmly in his stirrups, got his lance ready, brought his buckler before his breast, and planting himself in the middle of the road, stood waiting the approach of these knights-errant, for such he now considered and held them to be. And when they had come near enough to see and hear, he exclaimed with a haughty gesture, "All the world stand, unless all the world confess that in all the world there is no maiden fairer than the Empress of La Mancha, the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso." The traders halted at the sound of this language, and the sight of the strange figure that uttered it, and from both figure and language at once guessed the craze of their owner. They wished, however, to learn quietly what was the object of this confession that was demanded of them, and one of them, who was rather fond of a joke, and was very sharp-witted, said to him, "Sir Knight, we do not know who this good lady is that you speak of. Show her to us, for if she be of such beauty as you suggest, with all our hearts and without any pressure, we will confess the truth that is on your part required of us." "If I were to show her to you," replied Don Quixote, "what merit would you have in confessing a truth so manifest? The essential point is that without seeing her you must believe, confess, affirm, swear, and defend it. Else ye have to do with me in battle, ill-conditioned, arrogant rabble that ye are. and come ye on one by one, as the order of knighthood requires, or all together, as is the custom and vile usage of your breed. Here do I bide and await you, relying on the justice of the cause I maintain." "Sir Knight," replied the trader, "I entreat your worship in the name of this present company of princes, that to save us from charging our consciences with the confession of a thing we have never seen or heard of, and one moreover so much to the prejudice of the empresses and queens of the Alqueria and Estremadura, your worship will be pleased to show us some portrait of this lady, though it be no bigger than a grain of wheat, for by the thread one gets at the ball, and in this way we shall be satisfied and easy, and you will be content and pleased. Nay, I believe we are already so far agreed with you that, even though her portrait should show her blind of one eye, and distilling vermilion and sulphur from the other, we would nevertheless, to gratify your worship, say all in her favour that you desire." "She distills nothing of the kind, vile rabble," said Don Quixote, burning with rage. "Nothing of the kind, I say. Only ambergris and civet in cotton, nor is she one-eyed or hump-backed, but straighter than a Guadarrama spindle. But ye must pay for the blasphemy ye have uttered against beauty like that of my lady." And so saying, he charged with levelled lance against the one who had spoken with such fury and fierceness, that, if luck had not contrived that Rosinante should stumble midway and come down, it would have gone hard with the rash trader. Down went Rosinante, and over went his master, rolling along the ground for some distance, and when he tried to rise he was unable, so encumbered was he with lance, buckler, spurs, helmet, and the weight of his old armour. And all the while he was struggling to get up, he kept saying, "Fly not, cowards and caitiffs! Stay, for not by my fault, but my horse's, am I stretched here." One of the muleteers in attendance, who could not have had much good nature in him, hearing the poor prostrate man blustering in this style, was unable to refrain from giving him an answer on his ribs, and coming up to him he seized his lance, and having broken it in pieces, with one of them he began so to belabour our Don Quixote, that notwithstanding and in spite of his armour, he milled him like a measure of wheat. His masters called out not to lay on so hard, and to leave him alone, but the muleteer's blood was up, and he did not care to drop the game until he had vented the rest of his wrath, and gathering up the remaining fragments of the lance, he finished with a discharge upon the unhappy victim, who all through the storm of sticks that rained on him never ceased threatening heaven and earth and the brigands, for such they seemed to him. At last the muleteer was tired, and the traders continued their journey, taking with them matter for talk about the poor fellow who had been cudgelled. He, when he found himself alone, made another effort to rise, but if he was unable when whole and sound, how was he to rise after having been thrashed and well nigh knocked to pieces? And yet he esteemed himself fortunate, as it seemed to him that this was a regular knight-errant's mishap, and entirely he considered the fault of his horse. However, battered in body as he was, to rise was beyond his power. End of Section 43.
Section 44 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Doug Taylor, Sequim, Washington. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8, Section 44, Selected Excerpts by Cervantes, Part 2, by Miguel de Cervantes. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza sally forth, and the adventure with the windmills. He remained at home 15 days, very quietly, without showing any signs of a desire to take up with his former delusions, and during this time he held lively discussions with his two gossips, the curate and the barber, on the point he maintained, that knights-errant were what the world stood most in need of, and that in him was to be accomplished the revival of knight-errantry. The curate sometimes contradicted him, sometimes agreed with him, for if he had not observed this precaution, he would have been unable to bring him to reason. Meanwhile, Don Quixote worked upon a farm laborer, a neighbor of his, an honest man, if indeed that title can be given to him who is poor, but with very little wit in his pate. In a word, he so talked him over, and with such persuasions and promises, that the poor clown made up his mind to sally forth with him and serve him as esquire. Don Quixote, among other things, told him he ought to be ready to go with him gladly, because at any moment an adventure might occur that might win an island in the twinkling of an eye, and leave him governor of it. On these and the like promises, Sancho Panza, for so the laborer was called, left wife and children, and engaged himself as esquire to his neighbor. Don Quixote next set about getting some money, and selling one thing and pawning another, and making a bad bargain in every case. He got together a fair sum. He provided himself with a buckler, which he begged as a loan from a friend, and, restoring his battered helmet as best he could, he warned his squire, Sancho, of the day and hour he meant to set out, that he might provide himself with what he thought most needful. Above all, he charged him to take alforjas with him. The other said he would, and that he meant to take also a very good ass he had, as he was not much given to going on foot. About the ass, Don Quixote hesitated a little, trying whether he could call to mind any knight-errant taking with him an esquire mounted on ass-back, but no instance occurred to his memory. For all that, however, he determined to take him, intending to furnish him with a more honorable mount when a chance of it presented itself, by appropriating the horse of the first discourteous knight he encountered. Himself he provided with shirts and such other things as he could, according to the advice the host had given him. All which being settled and done, without taking leave, Sancho Panza of his wife and children, or Don Quixote of his housekeeper and niece, they sallied forth unseen by anybody from the village one night, and made such good way in the course of it that by daylight they held themselves safe from discovery, even should search be made for them. Sancho rode on his ass like a patriarch, with his alforjas and bota, and, longing to see himself soon governor of the island his master had promised him, Don Quixote decided upon taking the same route and road he had taken on his first journey, that over the Campo de Montiel, which he traveled with less discomfort than on the last occasion, for, as it was early morning, and the rays of the sun fell on them obliquely, the heat did not distress them. "And now," said Sancho Panza to his master, "your worship will take care, Señor Knight-errant, not to forget about the island you have promised me, for be it ever so big, I'll be equal to governing it." To which Don Quixote replied, "Thou must know, friend Sancho Panza, that it was a practice very much in vogue with the knights-errant of old, to make their squires governors of the islands or kingdoms they won, and I am determined that there shall be no failure on my part in so liberal a custom. On the contrary, I mean to improve upon it, For they sometimes, and perhaps most frequently, waited until their squires were old, and then, when they had had enough of service and hard days and worse nights, they gave them some title or other of count, or at the most marquis of some valley or province, more or less. But if thou livest and I live, it may well be that before 6 days are over I may have won some kingdom that has others dependent upon it, which will be just the thing to enable thee to be crowned king of one of them. Nor needst thou count this wonderful, for things and chances fall to the lot of such knights in ways so unexampled and unexpected that I might easily give thee even more than I promised thee.
Well, in that case, said Sancho Panza, if I should become a king by one of those miracles your worship speaks of, even Juana Gutierrez, my old woman, would come to be queen, and my children infantes?
Well, who doubts it? Said Don Quixote.
I doubt it, replied Sancho Panza, because, for my part, I am persuaded that though God should shower down kingdoms upon earth, not one of them would fit the head of Marie Gutierrez. Let me tell you, senor, she is not worth 2 maravedis for a queen. Countess will fit her better, and that only with God's help.
Leave it to God, Sancho, returned Don Quixote, for he will give her what suits her best. But do not undervalue thyself so much as to come to be content with anything less than being governor of a province.
I will not, senor, answered Sancho, especially as I have a man of such quality for master in your worship, who will be able to give me all that will be suitable for me, and that I can bear.
At this point they came in sight of 30 or 40 windmills that there are on that plain, and as soon as Don Quixote saw them, he said to his squire, Fortune is arranging matters for us better than we could have shaped our desires ourselves. For look there, friend Sancho Panza, where 30 or more monstrous giants present themselves, all of whom I mean to engage in battle and slay, and with whose spoils we shall begin to make our fortunes. For this is righteous warfare, and it is God's good service to sweep so evil a breed from off the face of the earth.
What giants? Said Sancho Panza.
Those thou seest there, answered his master, with the long arms, and some have them nearly 2 leagues long.
Look, your worship, said Sancho, what we see there are not giants, but windmills, and what seem to be their arms are the sails that, turned by the wind, make the millstones go.
It is easy to see, replied Don Quixote, that thou art not used to this business of adventures. Those are giants, and if thou art afraid, away with thee out of this, and betake thyself to prayer, while I engage them in fierce and unequal combat. So saying, he gave the spur to his steed Rozinante, heedless of the cries his squire Sancho sent after him, warning him that most certainly they were windmills and not giants he was going to attack. He, however, was so positive they were giants that he neither heard the cries of Sancho nor perceived, near as he was, what they were, but made at them, shouting, Fly not, cowards and vile beings, for it is a single knight that attacks you. A slight breeze at this moment sprang up, and the great sails began to move, seeing which Don Quixote exclaimed, Though ye flourish more arms than the giant Briareus, ye have to reckon with me. So saying, and commending himself with all his heart to his lady Dulcinea, imploring her to support him in such a peril, with lance in rest and covered by his buckler, he charged at Rozinante's fullest gallop, and fell upon the first mill that stood in front of him. But as he drove his lance point into the sail, the wind whirled it round with such force that it shivered the lance to pieces, sweeping with it horse and rider, who went rolling over the plain in a sorry condition. Sancho hastened to his assistance as fast as his ass could go, and when he came up, found him unable to move, with such a shock had Rocinante fallen with him.
God bless me, said Sancho, did I not tell your worship to mind what you were about, for they were only windmills, and no one could have made any mistake about it, but one who had something of the same kind in his head.
Hush, friend Sancho, replied Don Quixote. The fortunes of war, more than any other, are liable to frequent fluctuations, and moreover, I think, and it is the truth, that same sage Friston, who carried off my study and books, has turned these giants into mills in order to rob me of the glory of vanquishing them. Such is the enmity he bears me. But in the end, his wicked arts will avail but little against my good sword.
God order it as he may, said Sancho Panza,
and, helping him to rise, got him up again on Rocinante, whose shoulder was half out, and then, discussing the late adventure, they followed the road to Puerto Lapice, for there, said Don Quixote, they could not fail to find adventures in abundance and variety, as it was a great thoroughfare. Sancho Panza and his wife, Teresa, converse shrewdly. The translator of this history, when he comes to write this 5th chapter, says that he considers it apocryphal, because in it Sancho Panza speaks in a style unlike that which might have been expected from his limited intelligence, and says things so subtle that he does not think it possible he could have conceived them. However, desirous of doing what his task imposed upon him, he was unwilling to leave it untranslated, and therefore he went on to say, Sancho came home in such glee and spirits that his wife noticed his happiness a bow-shot off, so much so that it made her ask him, What have you got, Sancho friend, that you are so glad? To which he replied, Wife, if it were God's will, I should be very glad not to be so well pleased as I show myself. I don't understand you, husband, said she, and I don't know what you mean by saying you would be glad, if it were God's will, not to be well pleased. For fool as I am, I don't know how one can find pleasure in not having it. Harkye, Teresa, said Sancho, I am glad because I have made up my mind to go back to the service of my master Don Quixote, who means to go out a 3rd time to seek for adventures. And I am going with him again, for my necessities will have it so, and also the hope that cheers me with the thought that I may find another 100 crowns like those we have spent, though it makes me sad to have to leave thee and the children, and if God would be pleased to let me have my daily bread, dry shod and at home, without taking me out into the byways and crossroads, and he could do it at small cost by merely willing it, it is clear my happiness would be more solid and lasting, for the happiness I have is mingled with sorrow at leaving thee, so that I was right in saying I would be glad, if it were God's will, not to be well pleased. Look here, Sancho, said Teresa, ever since you joined on to a knight-errant, you talk in such a roundabout way that there's no understanding you. It is enough that God understands me, wife, replied Sancho, for he is the understander of all things. That will do. But mind, sister, you must look to Dapple carefully for the next 3 days, so that he may be fit to take arms. Double his feed, and see to the pack-saddle and other harness, for it is not to a wedding we are bound, but to go round the world, and to play at give and take with giants and dragons and monsters,
and hear hissings and roarings and bellowings and howlings, and even all this would be lavender if we had not to reckon with Yangusans and enchanted Moors." "I know well enough," said Teresa, "that squires errant don't eat their bread for nothing, and so I will be always praying to our Lord to deliver you speedily from all that hard fortune." "I can tell you, wife," said Sancho, "if I did not expect to see myself governor of an island before long, I would drop down dead on the spot." "Nay, then, husband," said Teresa, "let the hen live, though it be with her pip. Live, and let the devil take all the governments in the world. You came out of your mother's womb without a government. You have lived until now without a government. And when it is God's will, you will go, or be carried, to your grave without a government. How many there are in the world who live without a government, and continue to live all the same, and are reckoned in the number of people. The best sauce in the world is hunger, and as the poor are never without that, they always eat with a relish. But mind, Sancho, if by good luck you should find yourself with some government, don't forget me and your children. Remember that Sanchico is now full 15, and it is right he should go to school, if his uncle the abbot has a mind to have him trained for the church. Consider, too, that your daughter, Maria Sancha, will not die of grief if we marry her, for I have my suspicions that she is as eager to get a husband as you to get a government, and after all, a daughter looks better ill-married than well-kept." "By my faith," replied Sancho, "if God brings me to get any sort of a government, I intend, wife, to make such a high match for Maria Sancha that there will be no approaching her without calling her my lady." "Nay, Sancho," returned Teresa, "marry her to her equal. That is the safest plan, for if you put her out of wooden clogs into high-heeled shoes, out of her gray flannel petticoat into hoops and silk gowns, out of the plain Marisa and thou into Doña so-and-so and my lady, the girl won't know where she is, and at every turn she will fall into 1,000 blunders that will show the thread of her coarse homespun stuff." "Tut, you fool," said Sancho, "it will be only to practice it for 2 or 3 years, and then dignity and decorum will fit her as easily as a glove. And if not, what matter? Let her be my lady, and never mind what happens." "Keep to your own station, Sancho," replied Teresa. "Don't try to raise yourself higher, and bear in mind the proverb that says, 'Wipe the nose of your neighbor's son, and take him into your house.' A fine thing it would be indeed to marry our Maria to some great count or grand gentleman, who, when the humor took him, would abuse her, and call her clown-bred, and clodhopper's daughter, and spinning wench. I have not been bringing up my daughter for that all this time, I can tell you, husband. Do you bring home money, Sancho, and leave marrying her to my care. There is Lope Toco, Juan Toco's son, a stout, sturdy young fellow that we know, and I can see he does not look sour at the girl, and with him, one of our own sort, she will be well married, and we shall have her always under our eyes, and be all one family, parents and children, grandchildren and sons-in-law, and the peace and blessing of God will dwell among us. So don't you go marrying her in those courts and grand palaces where they won't know what to make of her, or she what to make of herself." "Why, you idiot and wife for Barabbas," said Sancho, "what do you mean by trying, without why or wherefore, to keep me from marrying my daughter to one who will give me grandchildren that will be called your lordship? Look ye, Teresa, I have always heard my elders say that he who does not know how to take advantage of luck when it comes to him has no right to complain if it gives him the go-by. And now that it is knocking at our door, it will not do to shut it out. Let us go with the favoring breeze that blows upon us." It is this sort of talk, and what Sancho says lower down, that made the translator of the history say he considered this chapter apocryphal. "Don't you see, you animal," continued Sancho, "that it will be well for me to drop into some profitable government that will lift us out of the mire, and marry Marie Sancha to whom I like, and you yourself will find yourself called Dona Teresa Panza, and sitting in church on a fine carpet and cushions and draperies, in spite and in defiance of all the born ladies of the town. No, stay as you are, growing neither greater nor less, like a tapestry figure. Let us say no more about it, for Sanchica shall be a countess, say what you will." "Are you sure of all you say, husband?" replied Teresa. "Well, for all that, I am afraid this rank of countess for my daughter will be her ruin. You do as you like, make a duchess or a princess of her, but I can tell you it will not be with my will and consent. I was always a lover of equality, brother, and I can't bear to see people give themselves airs without any right. They called me Teresa at my baptism, a plain, simple name, without any additions or tags or fringes of dones or donias. Cascajo was my father's name, and as I am your wife, I am called Teresa Panza, though by right I ought to be called Teresa Cascajo. But kings go where laws like, and I am content with this name, without having the Don put on top of it to make it so heavy that I cannot carry it. And I don't want to make people talk about me when they see me go dressed like a countess or governor's wife, for they will say at once, 'See what airs the slut gives herself. Only yesterday she was always spinning flax, and used to go to mass with the tail of her petticoat over her head instead of a mantle. And there she goes today in a hooped gown with her brooches and airs, as if we didn't know her. If God keeps me in my 7 senses, or 5, or whatever number I have, I am not going to bring myself to such a pass. Go you, brother, and be a government or an island man, and swagger as much as you like, for by the soul of my mother, neither my daughter nor I are going to stir a step from our village. A respectable woman should have a broken leg and keep at home, and to be busy at something is a virtuous damsel's holiday. Be off to your adventures along with your Don Quixote, and leave us to our misadventures, for God will mend them for us according as we deserve it. I don't know, I'm sure, who fixed the Don to him, but neither his father nor grandfather ever had." "I declare thou hast a devil of some sort in thy body," said Sancho. "God help thee, woman, what a lot of things thou hast strung together, one after the other, without head or tail. What have Cascajo and the brooches and the proverbs and the airs to do with what I say? Look here, fool and dolt, for so I may call you when you don't understand my words and run away from good fortune. If I had said that my daughter was to throw herself down from a tower, or go roaming the world as the Infanta Dona Urraca wanted to do, you would be right in not giving way to my will. But if in an instant, in less than the twinkling of an eye, I put the Don and my lady on her back, and take her out of the stubble, and place her under a canopy, on a dais, and on a couch with more velvet cushions than all the Almohades of Morocco ever had in their family, why won't you consent and fall in with my wishes?" "Do you know why, husband?" replied Teresa. "Because of the proverb that says, 'Who covers thee discovers thee.' At the poor man people only throw a hasty glance. On the rich man they fix their eyes. And if the said rich man was once on a time poor, it is then there is the sneering and the tattle and spite of backbiters, and in the streets here they swarm as thick as bees. Look here, Teresa, said Sancho, and listen to what I am now going to say to you. Maybe you never heard it in all your life, and I do not give my own notions, for what I am about to say are the opinions of his reverence the preacher, who preached in this town last Lent, and who said, if I remember rightly, that all things present that our eyes behold bring themselves before us, and remain and fix themselves on our memory, much better and more forcibly than things past. These observations, which Sancho makes here, are the other ones on account of which the translator says he regards this chapter as apocryphal, inasmuch as they are beyond Sancho's capacity. Whence it arises, he continued, that when we see any person well dressed, and making a figure with rich garments and retinue of servants, it seems to lead and impel us perforce to respect him, though memory may at the same time recall to us some lowly condition in which we have seen him, but which, whether it may have been poverty or low birth, being now a thing of the past, has no existence, while the only thing that has any existence is what we see before us. And if this person, whom fortune has raised from his original lowly state, these were the very words the padre used, to his present height of prosperity, be well-bred, generous, courteous to all, without seeking to vie with those whose nobility is of ancient date, depend upon it, Teresa, no one will remember what he was, and every one will respect what he is, except indeed the envious, from whom no fair fortune is safe. I do not understand you, husband, replied Teresa. Do as you like, and don't break my head with any more speechifying and rhetoric, and if you have resolved to do what you say— Resolved, you should say, woman, said Sancho, not revolved. Don't set yourself to wrangle with me, husband, said Teresa. I speak as God pleases, and don't deal in out-of-the-way phrases. And I say, if you are bent upon having a government, take your son Sancho with you, and teach him from this time on how to hold a government, for sons ought to inherit and learn the trades of their fathers. As soon as I have a government, said Sancho, I will send for him by post, and I will send thee money, of which I shall have no lack, for there is never any want of people to lend it to governors when they have not got it. And do thou dress him so as to hide what he is, and make him look what he is to be. You send the money, said Teresa, and I'll dress him up for you as fine as you please. Then we are agreed that our daughter is to be a countess, said Sancho. The day that I see her a countess, replied Teresa, it will be the same to me as if I was burying her. But once more I say, do as you please, for we women are born to this burden of being obedient to our husbands, though they be dogs. And with this she began to weep in downright earnest, as if she already saw Sanchica dead and buried. Sancho consoled her by saying that, though he must make her a countess, he would put it off as long as possible. Here their conversation came to an end, and Sancho went back to see Don Quixote and make arrangements for their departure. End of section 44. Section number 45 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
Recording by Doug Taylor, Squim, Washington. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8, Section 45. Selected Excerpts by Cervantes, Part 3, by Miguel de Cervantes. Of Sancho Panza's delectable discourse with the Duchess. The history records that Sancho did not sleep that afternoon, but, in order to keep his word, came, before he had well done dinner, to visit the Duchess, who, finding enjoyment in listening to him, made him sit down beside her on a low seat, though Sancho, out of pure good breeding, wanted not to sit down. The Duchess, however, told him he was to sit down as governor and talk as squire, as in both respects he was worthy of even the chair of Cid Ruy Diaz, the campeador. Sancho shrugged his shoulders, obeyed, and sat down, and all the Duchess's damsels and duennas gathered round him, waiting in profound silence to hear what he would say. It was the Duchess, however, who spoke first, saying, "Now that we are alone, and that there is nobody here to overhear us, I should be glad if the Señor Governor would relieve me of certain doubts I have, rising out of the history of the great Don Quixote that is now in print. One is, inasmuch as worthy Sancho never saw Dulcinea, I mean the Lady Dulcinea del Toboso, nor took Don Quixote's letter to her, for it was left in the memorandum book in the Sierra Morena, how did he dare to invent the answer and all that about finding her sifting wheat? The whole story being a deception and falsehood, and so much to the prejudice of the peerless Dulcinea's good name, a thing that is not at all becoming the character and fidelity of a good squire." At these words Sancho, without uttering one in reply, got up from his chair, and, with noiseless steps, with his body bent and his finger on his lips, went all round the room, lifting up the hangings, and this done, he came back to his seat and said, "Now, Señora, that I have seen that there is no one except the bystanders listening to us on the sly, I will answer what you have asked me, and all that you may ask me, without fear or dread. And the first thing I have got to say is, that for my own part I hold my master Don Quixote to be stark mad, though sometimes he says things that to my mind, and indeed everybody's that listens to him, are so wise and run in such a straight furrow that Satan himself could not have set them better. But for all that, really and beyond all question, it's my firm belief he is cracked. Well, then, as this is clear to my mind, I can venture to make him believe things that have neither head nor tail, like that affair of the answer to the letter, and that other of 6 or 8 days ago, which is not yet in history, that is to say, the affair of the enchantment of my lady Dulcinea, for I made him believe she is enchanted, though there's no more truth in it than over the hills of Ubeda." The Duchess begged him to tell her about the enchantment or deception, so Sancho told the whole story, exactly as it had happened, and his hearers were not a little amused by it. And then, resuming, the Duchess said, "In consequence of what worthy Sancho has told me, a doubt starts up in my mind, and there comes a kind of whisper to my ears that says, if Don Quixote be mad, crazy, cracked, and Sancho his squire knows it, and notwithstanding serves and follows him, and goes trusting to his empty promises, there can be no doubt he must be still madder and sillier than his master. And that being so, it will be casting your teeth, Señora Duchess, if you give the said Sancho an island to govern, for how will he who does not know how to govern himself know how to govern others?" "My God, Señora," said Sancho, "but that doubt comes timely. But your grace may say it out, and speak plainly or as you like, for I know what you say is true, and if I were wise I should have left my master long ago, but this was my fate.
This was my bad luck. I can't help it. I must follow him. We're from the same village. I have eaten his bread. I'm fond of him. I'm grateful he gave me his ass colts. And above all, I'm faithful. So it's quite impossible for anything to separate us except the pickaxe and shovel. And if your highness does not like to give me the government you promised, God made me without it, and maybe your not giving it to me will be all the better for my conscience. For, fool as I am, I know the proverb, to her hurt the ant got wings. And it may be that Sancho the squire will get to heaven sooner than Sancho the governor. They make as good bread here as in France, and by night all cats are gray, and a hard case enough his who hasn't broken his fast at 2 in the afternoon. And there's no stomach a hand's breadth bigger than another, and the same can be filled with straw or hay, as the saying is, and the little birds of the field have God for their purveyor and caterer, and 4 yards of Quenza Frieze keep one warmer than 4 of Segovia broadcloth. And when we quit this world and are put underground, the prince travels by as narrow a path as the journeyman. And the Pope's body does not take up more feet of earth than the sacristan's, for all that the one is higher than the other. For when we go to our graves, we all pack ourselves up and make ourselves small. Or rather, they pack us up and make us small in spite of us. And then good night to us. And I say once more, if your ladyship does not like to give me the island because I'm a fool, like a wise man, I will take care to give myself no trouble about it. I have heard say that behind the cross there's the devil, and that all that glitters is not gold, and that from among the oxen and the plows and the yokes, Wamba the husbandman was taken to be made king of Spain, and from among brocades and pleasures and riches, Roderick was taken to be devoured by adders, if the verses of the old ballads don't lie. To be sure they don't lie, exclaimed Doña Rodriguez, the duenna, who was one of the listeners. Why, there's a ballad that says they put King Rodrigo alive into a tomb full of toads and adders and lizards, and that 2 days afterwards the king, in a plaintive, feeble voice, cried out from within the tomb, "They gnaw me now, they gnaw me now, there where I most did sin." And according to that, the gentleman has good reason to say he would rather be a laboring man than a king, if vermin are to eat him up. The Duchess could not help laughing at the simplicity of her duenna, or wondering at the language and proverbs of Sancho, to whom she said, "Worthy Sancho knows very well that when once a knight has made a promise, he strives to keep it, though it should cost him his life. My lord and husband the Duke, though not one of the errant sort, is none the less a knight for that reason, and will keep his word about the promised island, in spite of the envy and malice of the world. Let Sancho be of good cheer, for when he least expects it, he will find himself seated on the throne of his island and seat of dignity, and will take possession of his government, that he may discard it for another of 3-bordered brocade. The charge I give him is to be careful how he governs his vassals, bearing in mind that they are all loyal and well-born." "As to governing them well," said Sancho, "there's no need of charging me to do that, for I am kind-hearted by nature and full of compassion for the poor. There's no stealing a loaf from him who needs and bakes, and by my faith it won't do to throw false dice with me. I am an old dog, and I know all about tuss. I can be wide awake if need be, and I don't let clouds come before my eyes, for I know where the shoe pinches me. I say so, because with me the good will have support and protection, and the bad neither footing nor access, and it seems to me that in governments to make a beginning is everything, and maybe after having been governor a fortnight, I'll take kindly to the work, and know more about it than the field labor I have been brought up to." "You are right, Sancho," said the Duchess, "for no one is born ready taught, and the bishops are made out of men and not out of stones. But To return to the subject we were discussing just now, the enchantment of the Lady Dulcinea, I look upon it as certain, and something more than evident, that Sancho's idea of practicing a deception upon his master, making him believe that the peasant girl was Dulcinea, and that if he did not recognize her, it must be because she was enchanted, was all a device of one of the enchanters that persecute Don Quixote. For, in truth and earnest, I know from good authority that the coarse country wench who jumped up on the ass was and is Dulcinea del Toboso, and that worthy Sancho, though he fancies himself a deceiver, is the one that is deceived, and that there is no more reason to doubt the truth of this than of anything else we never saw. Señor Sancho Panza must know that we too have enchanters here that are well disposed to us, and tell us what goes on in the world plainly and distinctly, without subterfuge or deception. And believe me, Sancho, that agile country lass was and is Dulcinea del Toboso, who is as much enchanted as the mother that bore her, and when we least expect it, we shall see her in her own proper form, and then Sancho will be disabused of the error he is under at present. All that's very possible, said Sancho Panza, and now I'm willing to believe what my master says about what he saw in the cave of Montesinos, where he says he saw the Lady Dulcinea del Toboso in the very same dress and apparel that I said I had seen her in when I enchanted her, all to please myself. Oh, it must be all exactly the other way, as your ladyship says, because it is impossible to suppose that out of my poor wit such a cunning trick could be concocted in a moment, nor do I think my master is so mad that by my weak and feeble persuasion he could be made to believe a thing so out of all reason. But, Signora, your excellence must not therefore think me ill-disposed, for a dolt like me is not bound to see into the thoughts and plots of those vile enchanters. I invented all that to escape my master's scolding, and not with any intention of hurting him. And if it has turned out differently, there is a God in heaven who judges our hearts. That is true, said the Duchess. But tell me, Sancho, what is this you say about the cave of Montesinos? For I should like to know. Sancho, upon this, related to her word for word what has been said already touching that adventure, and having heard it, the Duchess said, From this occurrence it may be inferred that, as the great Don Quixote says, he saw there the same country wench Sancho saw on the way from El Toboso. It is no doubt Dulcinea, and there are some very active and exceedingly busy enchanters about. So I say, said Sancho, and if my lady Dulcinea is enchanted, so much the worse for her, and I'm not going to pick a quarrel with my master's enemies, who seem to be many and spiteful. The truth is that the one I saw was a country wench, and I set her down to be a country wench. And if that was Dulcinea, it must not be laid at my door, nor should I be called to answer for it or take the consequences. But they must go nagging at me at every step. Sancho said it, Sancho did it, Sancho here, Sancho there, as if Sancho was nobody at all, and not that same Sancho Panza that's now going all over the world in books. So Samson Carrasco told me. And he's at any rate one that's a bachelor of Salamanca, and people of that sort can't lie, except when the whim seizes them, or they have some very good reason for it. So there's no occasion for anybody to quarrel with me. And then I have a good character, and as I have heard my master say, a good name is better than great riches. Let them only stick me into this government, and they'll see wonders, for one who has been a good squire will be a good governor. All worthy Sancho's observations, said the Duchess, are Catatonian sentences, or at any rate out of the very heart of Michael Verino himself, who florentibus occidit annis. In fact, to speak in his own style, under a bad cloak there's often a good drinker. Indeed, Senora, said Sancho, I never yet drank out of wickedness. From thirst I have, very likely, for I have nothing of the hypocrite in me. I drink when I'm inclined, or if I'm not inclined when they offer it to me, so as not to look either straight-laced or ill-bred. For when a friend drinks one's health, what heart can be so hard as not to return it? But if I put on my shoes, I don't dirty them. Besides, squires to knights-errant mostly drink water, for they are always wandering among woods, forests, and meadows, mountains, and crags, without a drop of wine to be had if they gave their eyes for it. So I believe, said the Duchess. And now let Sancho go and take his sleep, and we will talk by and by at greater length, and settle how he may soon go and stick himself into the government, as he says. Sancho once more kissed the Duchess's hand, and entreated her to be so kind as to let good care be taken of his Dapple, for he was the light of his eyes. What is Dapple? said the Duchess. My ass, said Sancho, which, not to mention him by that name, I'm accustomed to call Dapple. I begged this Lady Duenna here to take care of him when I came into the castle, and she got as angry as if I had said she was ugly or old. Though it ought to be more natural and proper for duennas to feed asses than to ornament chambers. God bless me! What a spite a gentleman of my village had against these ladies. He must have been some clown, said Dona Rodriguez the duenna, for if he had been a gentleman and well born, he would have exalted them higher than the horns of the moon. That will do, said the Duchess. No more of this. Hush, Dona Rodriguez, and let Señor Panza rest easy, and leave the treatment of Dapple in my charge. For as he is a treasure of Sancho's, I'll put him on the apple of my eye. It will be enough for him to be in the stable, said Sancho, for neither he nor I are worthy to rest a moment in the apple of your highness's eye, and I'd as soon stab myself as consent to it. For though my master says that in civilities it is better to lose by a card too many than a card too few, when it comes to civilities to asses, we must mind what we are about and keep within due bounds. Take him to your government, Sancho, said the Duchess, and there you will be able to make as much of him as you like, and even release him from work and pension him off. Don't think, Señora Duchess, that you have said anything absurd, said Sancho. I have seen more than 2 asses go to governments, and for me to take mine with me would be nothing new. Sancho's words made the Duchess laugh again, and gave her fresh amusement, and, dismissing him to sleep, she went away to tell the Duke the conversation she had had with him. End of section 45. Recording by Doug Taylor, Squim, Washington. Section 46 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Doug Taylor, Squim, Washington. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8, Section 46. Selected Excerpts by Cervantes, Part 4, by Miguel de Cervantes. Sancho Panza as governor. The history says that from the justice court they carried Sancho to a sumptuous palace, where, in a spacious chamber, there was a table laid out with royal magnificence. The clarions sounded as Sancho entered the room, and 4 pages came forward to present him with water for his hands, which Sancho received with great dignity. The music ceased, and Sancho seated himself at the head of the table, for there was only that seat placed, and no more than the one cover laid. A personage, who it appeared afterwards was a physician,
placed himself standing by his side with a whalebone wand in his hand. They then lifted up a fine white cloth covering fruit and a great variety of dishes of different sorts. One who looked like a student said grace, and a page put a laced bib on Sancho, while another, who played the part of head carver, placed a dish of fruit before him. But hardly had he tasted a morsel, when the man with the wand touched the plate with it, and they took it away from before him with the utmost celerity. The carver, however, brought him another dish, and Sancho proceeded to try it. But before he could get at it, not to say taste it, already the wand had touched it, and a page had carried it off with the same promptitude as the fruit. Sancho, seeing this, was puzzled, and, looking from one to another, asked if this dinner was to be eaten after the fashion of a jugglery trick.
"It is not to be eaten, Señor Governor, except as is usual and customary in other islands where there are governors. I, Señor, am a physician, and I am paid a salary in this island to serve its governors as such, and I have a much greater regard for their health than for my own, studying day and night, and making myself acquainted with the governor's constitution, in order to be able to cure him when he falls sick. The chief thing I have to do is to attend at his dinners and suppers, and allow him to eat what appears to me to be fit for him, and keep from him what I think will do him harm, and be injurious to his stomach. And therefore I ordered that the plate of fruit be removed as being too moist, and that other dish I ordered to be removed as being too hot, and containing too many spices that stimulate thirst. For he who drinks much kills and consumes the radical moisture wherein life consists."
"Well, then," said Sancho, "that dish of roast partridges there that seems so savory will not do me any harm."
To this the physician replied, "Of those, my lord, the governor shall not eat so long as I live."
"Why so?"
replied Sancho. "Because," replied the doctor, "our master Hippocrates, the pole star and beacon of medicine, says in one of his aphorisms, Omnis saturatio mala pericis autem pissima, which means, all repletion is bad, but that of partridge is the worst of all."
"In that case," said Sancho, "let Señor Doctor see among the dishes that are on the table what will do me most good and least harm, and let me eat it without tapping it with his stick. For by the life of the governor, and so may God suffer me to enjoy it, but I'm dying of hunger, and in spite of the doctor and all he may say, to deny me food is to take my life instead of prolonging it."
"Your worship is right, Señor Governor," said the physician, "and therefore your worship, I consider, should not eat of those stewed rabbits there, because it is a furry kind of food.
If that veal were not roasted and served with pickles, you might try it, but
it is out of the question."
"That big dish that is smoking farther off," said Sancho, "seems to me to be an olla podrida. Out of the diversity of things in such ollas, I can't fail to light upon something tasty and good for me."
"Absit," said the doctor, "far from us be any such base thought. There is nothing in the world less nourishing than an olla podrida. To canons, or rectors of colleges, or peasants' weddings with your ollas podridas. But let us have none of them on the tables of governors, where everything that is present should be delicate and refined. And the reason is that always, everywhere, and by everybody, simple medicines are more esteemed than compound ones. For we cannot go wrong in those that are simple, while in the compound we may, by merely altering the quantity of the things composing them. But what I am of opinion the governor should eat now, in order to preserve and fortify his health, is 100 or so of wafer cakes, and a few thin slices of conserve of quinces, which will settle his stomach
and help his digestion." Sancho, on hearing this, threw himself back in his chair and surveyed the doctor steadily, and in a solemn tone asked him what his name was and where he had studied. He replied, "My name, Señor Governor, is Doctor Pedro Recio de Agüero. I am a native of a place called Tirteafuera, which lies between Caracuel and Almodovar del Campo on the right-hand side, and I have a degree of doctor from the University of Osuna." To which Sancho, glowing all over with rage, returned, "Then let Dr. Pedro Recio de Maguero, native of Tirteafuera, a place that's on the right-hand side as we go from Caracuel to Almodovar del Campo, graduate of Osuna, get out of my presence at once, for I swear by the sun I'll take a cudgel, and by dint of blows, beginning with him, I'll not leave a doctor in the whole island, at least of those I know to be ignorant. For as to learned, wise, sensible physicians, them I will reverence and honor as divine persons. Once more I say, let Pedro Recio get out this, or I'll take this chair I am sitting on and break it over his head. And if they call me to account for it, I'll clear myself by saying I served God in killing a bad doctor, a general executioner. And now give me something to eat, or else take your government, for a trade that does not feed its master is not worth 2 beans. Sancho, fool, boor, and clown that he was, held his own against them all, saying to those round him, and to Dr. Pedro Recio, who, as soon as the private business of the Duke's letter was disposed of, had returned to the room, "Now I see plainly enough that judges and governors ought to be, and must be, made of brass, not to feel the importunities of the applicants that at all times and all seasons insist on being heard, and having their business dispatched, and their own affairs and no others attended to, come what may. And if the poor judge does not hear them and settle the matter, either because he cannot, or because that is not the time set apart for hearing them, forthwith they abuse him, run him down, and gnaw at his bones, and even pick holes in his pedigree. You silly, stupid applicant, don't be in a hurry. Wait for the proper time and season for doing business. Don't come at dinner hour or at bedtime, for judges are only flesh and blood, and must give to nature what she naturally demands of them, all except myself, for in my case I give her nothing to eat, thanks to Señor Dr. Pedro Recio Tirteafuera here, who would have me die of hunger, and declares that death to be life, and the same sort of life may God give him and all his kind, I mean bad doctors, for the good ones deserve palms and laurels." All who knew Sancho Panza were astonished to hear him speak so elegantly, and did not know what to attribute it to, unless it were that office and grave responsibility either smarten or stupefy men's wits. At last Dr. Pedro Recio Agüero of Tirteafuera promised to let him have supper that night, though it might be in contravention of all the aphorisms of Hippocrates. With this the governor was satisfied, and looked forward to the approach of night and supper time with great anxiety. And though time to his mind stood still and made no progress, nevertheless the hour he so longed for came, and they gave him a beef salad with onions, and some boiled calves' feet rather far gone. At this he fell to with greater relish than if they had given him francolins from Milan, pheasants from Rome, veal from Sorrento, partridges from Morone, or geese from Lavajos. And turning to the doctor at supper, he said to him, "Look here, Señor Doctor, for the future, don't trouble yourself about giving me dainty things or choice dishes to eat, for it will be only taking my stomach off its hinges. It is accustomed to goat, cow, bacon, hung beef, turnips and onions, and if by any chance it is given these palace dishes, it receives them squeamishly, and sometimes with loathing. What the head carver had best do
is to serve me with what they call ollas podridas, and the rottener they are, the better they smell. And he can put whatever he likes into them, so long as it is good to eat, and I'll be obliged to him. I will requite him some day. But let nobody play pranks on me, for either we are or we are not. Let us live and eat in peace and good fellowship. For when God sends the dawn, he sends it for all. I mean to govern this island without giving up a right or taking a bribe. Let everyone keep his eye open and look out for the arrow. For I can tell them, the devil's in Cantillana, and if they drive me to it, they'll see something that will astonish them. Nay, make yourself honey, and the flies will eat you.
Of a truth, Señor Governor, said the carver, your worship is in the right of it in everything you have said, and I promise you in the name of all the inhabitants of this island that they will serve your worship with all zeal, affection, and good will, for the mild kind of government you have given a sample of to begin with leaves them no ground for doing or thinking anything to your worship's disadvantage.
That I believe, said Sancho, and they would be great fools if they did or thought otherwise. Once more I say, see to my feeding and my dapples, for that is the great point and what is most to the purpose, and when the hour comes let us go the rounds, for it is my intention to purge this island of all manner of uncleanness and of all idle good-for-nothing vagabonds. For I would have you know, my friends, that lazy idlers are the same thing in a state as the drones in a hive, and eat up the honey the industrious bees make. I mean to protect the husbandman, to preserve to the gentleman his privileges, to reward the virtuous, and above all to respect religion and honor its ministers. What say you to that, my friends? Is there anything in what I say, or am I talking to no purpose?
There is so much in what your worship says, Señor Governor, said the major domo, that I am filled with wonder when I see a man like your worship, entirely without learning, for I believe you have none at all, say such things, and so full of sound maxims and sage remarks, very different from what was expected of your worship's intelligence by those who sent us, or by us who came here. Every day we see something new in this world. Jokes become realities, and the jokers find the tables turned upon them.
Day came after the night of the governor's round, a night which the head carver passed without sleeping, so full were his thoughts of the face and air and beauty of the disguised damsel, while the major domo spent what was left of it in writing an account to his lord and lady of all Sancho said and did, being as much amazed at his sayings as at his doings, for there was a mixture of shrewdness and simplicity in all his words and deeds. The Señor Governor got up, and, by Dr. Pedro Reccio's directions, they made him break his fast on a little conserve and 4 sups of cold water, which Sancho would have readily exchanged for a piece of bread and a bunch of grapes, but seeing there was no help for it, he submitted with no little sorrow of heart and a discomfort of stomach, Pedro Recio having persuaded him that light and delicate diet enlivened the wits, and that was what was most essential for persons placed in command and in responsible situations, where they have to employ not only the bodily powers, but those of the mind also. By means of this sophistry, Sancho was made to endure hunger, and hunger so keen that in his heart he cursed the government, and even him who had given it to him. However, with his hunger and his conserve, he undertook to deliver judgments that day, and the first thing that came before him was a question that was submitted to him by a stranger in the presence of the major domo and the other attendants, and it was in these words: Señor, a large river, separated 2 districts of one and the same lordship. Will your worship please to pay attention? For the case is an important and a rather naughty one. Well, then, on this river there was a bridge, and at one end of it a gallows, and a sort of tribunal, where 4 judges commonly sat to administer the law which the lord of the river bridge and the lordship had enacted. and which was to this effect: if any one crosses by this bridge from one side to the other, he shall declare on oath where he is going and with what object, and if he swears truly, he shall be allowed to pass, but if falsely, he shall be put to death for it by hanging on the gallows erected there, without any remission. Though the law and its severe penalty were known, many persons crossed, but in their declarations it was easy to see at once they were telling the truth, and the judges let them pass free. It happened, however, that one man, when they came to take his declaration, swore, and said that by the oath he took, he was going to die upon that gallows that stood there, and nothing else. The judges held a consultation over the oath, and they said, if we let this man pass free, he has sworn falsely, and by the law he ought to die. But if we hang him, as he swore he was going to die on that gallows, and therefore swore the truth, by the same law he ought to go free. It is asked of your lordship, Señor Governor, what are the judges to do with this man? For they are still in doubt and perplexity. And, having heard of your worship's acute and exalted intellect, they have sent me to entreat your worship, on their behalf, to give your opinion on this very intricate and puzzling case. To this Sancho made answer, indeed, those gentlemen, the judges that send you to me, might have spared themselves the trouble, for I have more of the obtuse than the acute in me. However, repeat the case over again, so that I may understand it, and then perhaps I may be able to hit the point. The querist repeated again and again what he had said before, and then Sancho said, it seems to me I can set the matter right in a moment, and in this way. The man swears that he is going to die upon the gallows, but if he dies upon it, he has sworn the truth, and by the law enacted, deserves to go free and pass over the bridge. But if they don't hang him, then he has sworn falsely, and by the same law deserves to be hanged. It is as the Señor Governor says, said the messenger, and as regards a complete comprehension of the case, there is nothing left to desire or hesitate about. Well, then, I say, said Sancho, that of this man they should let pass the part that is sworn truly, and hang the part that is lied, and in this way the conditions of the passage will be fully complied with. But then, Señor Governor, replied the querist, the man will have to be divided into two parts, and if he is divided, of course he will die, and so none of the requirements of the law will be carried out, and it is absolutely necessary to comply with it. Look here, my good sir, said Sancho, either I'm a numbskull, or else there is the same reason for this passenger dying as for his living and passing over the bridge. For if the truth saves him, the falsehood equally condemns him, and that being the case, it is my opinion you should say to the gentleman who sent you to me, that as the arguments for condemning him and for absolving him are exactly balanced, they should let him pass freely, as it is always more praiseworthy to do good than to do evil. This I would give signed with my name, if I knew how to sign. And what I have said in this case is not out of my own head, but one of the many precepts my master Don Quixote gave me the night before I left to become governor of this island. That came into my mind, and it was this, that when there was any doubt about the justice of a case, I should lean to mercy, and it is God's will that I should recollect it now, for it fits this case as if it was made for it.
That is true, said the major domo, and I maintain that Lycurgus himself, who gave laws to the Lacedaemonians, could not have pronounced a better decision than the great Panza has given. Let the morning's audience close with this, and I will see that the Señor Governor has dinner entirely to his liking.
That's all I ask for, fair play, said Sancho. Give me my dinner, and then let it rain cases and questions on me, and I'll dispatch them in a twinkling.
The major domo kept his word, for he felt it against his conscience to kill so wise a governor by hunger, particularly as he intended to have done with him that same night. playing off the last joke he was commissioned to practice upon him. It came to pass then that, after he had dined that day, in opposition to the rules and aphorisms of Dr. Tirteafuera, as they were taking away the cloth, there came a courier with a letter from Don Quixote for the governor. Sancho ordered the secretary to read it to himself, and if there was nothing in it that demanded secrecy, to read it aloud. The secretary did so, and after he had skimmed the contents, he said, "It may well be read aloud, for what Señor Don Quixote writes to your worship deserves to be printed or written in letters of gold, and it is as follows." Don Quixote of La Mancha's letter to Sancho Panza, governor of the island of Barataria. When I was expecting to hear of thy stupidities and blunders, friend Sancho, I have received intelligence of thy displays of good sense, for which I give special thanks to heaven, that can raise the poor from the dunghill, and of fools to make wise men. They tell me thou dost govern as if thou wert a man, and art a man as if thou wert a beast. So great is the humility wherewith thou dost comport thyself. But I would have thee bear in mind, Sancho, that very often it is fitting and necessary for the authority of office to resist the humility of the heart, for the seemly array of one who is invested with grave duties should be such as they require, and not measured by what his own humble tastes may lead him to prefer. Dress well. A stick dressed up does not look like a stick. I do not say thou shouldst wear trinkets or fine raiment, or that, being a judge, thou shouldst dress like a soldier, but that thou shouldst array thyself in the apparel thy office requires, and that at the same time it be neat and handsome. To win the good will of the people thou governest, there are two things among others that thou must do. One is to be civil to all, this, however, I told thee before, and the other is to take care that food be abundant, for there is nothing that vexes the heart of the poor more than hunger and high prices. Make not many proclamations, but those thou makest take care that they be good ones, and above all that they be observed and carried out. For proclamations that are not observed are the same as if they did not exist. Nay, they encourage the idea that the prince who had the wisdom and authority to make them had not the power to enforce them. And laws that threaten and are not enforced come to be like the log, the king of the frogs, that frightened them at first, but that in time they despised and mounted upon. Be a father to virtue and a stepfather to vice. Be not always strict, nor yet always lenient, but observe a mean between these two extremes, for in that is the aim of wisdom. Visit the jails, the slaughter-houses, and the market-places, for the presence of the governor is of great importance in such places. It comforts the prisoners, who are in hopes of a speedy release. It is the bugbear of the butchers, who have then to give just weight, and it is the terror of the market-women for the same reason. Let it not be seen that thou art, even if perchance thou art, which I do not believe, covetous, a follower of women, or a glutton. For when the people, and those that have dealings with thee, become aware of thy special weakness, they bring their batteries to bear upon thee in that quarter, till they have brought thee down to the depths of perdition. Consider and reconsider, con and con over again, the advice and the instructions I gave thee before thy departure hence to thy government, and thou wilt see that in them, if thou dost follow them, thou hast a help at hand that will lighten for thee the troubles and difficulties that beset governors at every step. Write to thy lord and lady, and show thyself grateful to them, for ingratitude is the daughter of pride, and one of the greatest sins we know of, and he who is grateful to those who have been good to him shows that he will be so to God also, who has bestowed and still bestows so many blessings upon him. My lady, the Duchess, sent off a messenger with thy suit and another present to thy wife Teresa Panza. We expect the answer every moment. I have been a little indisposed through a certain scratching I came in for, not very much to the benefit of my nose, but it was nothing. For if there are enchanters who maltreat me, there are also some who defend me. Let me know if the major domo who is with thee had any share in the Trifaldi performance, as thou didst suspect, and keep me informed of everything that happens thee, as the distance is so short. All the more as I am thinking of giving over very shortly this idle life I am now leading, for I was not born for it. A thing has occurred to me which I am inclined to think will put me out of favor with the Duke and Duchess. But though I am sorry for it, I do not care, for after all I must obey my calling rather than their pleasure, in accordance with the common saying, Amicus Plato sed magis amica veritas. I quote this Latin to thee because I conclude that since thou hast been a governor, thou wilt have learned it. Adieu. God keep thee from being an object of pity to any one. Thy friend, Don Quixote de la Mancha. Sancho listened to the letter with great attention, and it was praised and considered wise by all who heard it. He then rose up from table, and, calling his secretary, shut himself in with him in his own room, and, without putting it off any longer, set about answering his master Don Quixote at once. And he bade the secretary write down what he told him, without adding or suppressing anything, which he did, and the answer was to the following effect. Sancho Panza's letter to Don Quixote of La Mancha. The pressure of business is so great upon me that I have no time to scratch my head, or even to cut my nails, and I have them so long. God send a remedy for it. I say this, master of my soul, that you may not be surprised if I have not until now sent you word how I fare, well or ill, in this government, in which I am suffering more hunger than when we two were wandering through the woods and wastes. My lord the Duke wrote to me the other day to warn me that certain spies had got into this island to kill me, but up to the present I have not found out any, except a certain doctor who receives a salary in this town for killing all the governors that come here. He is called Dr. Pedro Recio, and is from Tirteafuera. So you can see what a name he has to make me dread dying under his hands. This doctor says of himself that he does not cure diseases when there are any, but prevents them coming, and the medicines he uses are diet and more diet, until he brings one down to bare bones, as if leanness was not worse than fever. In short, he is killing me with hunger, and I am dying myself of vexation. For when I thought I was coming to this government to get my meat hot and my drink cool, and take my ease between Holland sheets on feather beds, I find I have come to do penance, as if I was a hermit. And as I don't do it willingly, I suspect that in the end the devil will carry me off. So far I have not handled any dues or taken any bribes, and I don't know what to think of it. For here they tell me that the governors that come to this island before entering it have plenty of money, either given to them or lent to them by the people of the town, and that this is the usual custom, not only here, but with all who enter upon governments. Last night, going the rounds, I came upon a fair damsel in man's clothes, and a brother of hers dressed as a woman. My head carver has fallen in love with the girl, and has in his own mind chosen her for a wife, so he says, and I have chosen the youth for a son-in-law. Today we are going to explain our intentions to the father of the pair, who is one Diego de la Llana, a gentleman and an old Christian, as much as you please. I have visited the marketplaces, as your worship advises me, and yesterday I found a stall-keeper selling new hazelnuts, and proved her to have mixed a bushel of old, empty, rotten nuts with a bushel of new. I confiscated the whole for the children of the charity school, who will know how to distinguish them well enough, and I sentenced her not to come into the marketplace for a fortnight. They told me I did bravely. I can tell your worship it is commonly said in this town that there are no people worse than the market women, for they are all barefaced, unconscionable, and impudent.
and I can well believe it from what I have seen in them in other towns. I am very glad my lady the Duchess has written to my wife Teresa Panza, and sent her the present your worship speaks of, and I will try to show myself grateful when the time comes. Kiss her hands for me, and tell her I say she has not thrown it into a sack with a hole in it, as she will see in the end. I should not like your worship to have any difference with my lord and lady, for if you fall out with them, it is plain it must do me harm, and as you give me advice to be grateful, it will not do for your worship not to be so yourself to those who have shown you such kindness, and by whom you have been treated so hospitably in their castle. That about the scratching I don't understand, but I suppose it must be one of the ill turns the wicked enchanters are always doing your worship. When we meet I shall know all about it. I wish I could send your worship something, but I don't know what to send, unless it be some very curious clyster pipes to work with bladders that they make in this island. But if the office remains with me, I'll find out something to send one way or another. If my wife Teresa Panza writes to me, pay the postage and send me the letter, for I have a very great desire to hear how my house and wife and children are going on. And so may God deliver your worship from evil-minded enchanters, and bring me well and peacefully out of this government, which I doubt, for I expect to take leave of it and my life together, from the way Dr. Pedro Recio treats me. Your worship's servant, Sancho Panza, the governor. The secretary sealed the letter and immediately dismissed the courier, and those who were carrying on the joke against Sancho, putting their heads together, arranged how he was to be dismissed from the government. Sancho spent the afternoon in drawing up certain ordinances relating to the good government of what he fancied the island. He reduced the prices of shoes, boots, and stockings, but of shoes in particular, as they seemed to him to run extravagantly high. He established a fixed rate for servants' wages, which were becoming recklessly exorbitant. He laid extremely heavy penalties upon those who sang lewd or loose songs either by day or night. He decreed that no blind man should sing of any miracle in verse unless he could produce authentic evidence that it was true, for it was his opinion that most of those the blind men sing are trumped up to the detriment of the true ones. He established and created an alguacil of the poor, not to harass them, but to examine them and see whether they really were so. For many a sturdy thief or drunkard goes about under cover of a make-believe crippled limb or a sham sore. In a word, he made so many good rules that to this day they are preserved there and are called the Constitutions of the Great Governor Sancho Panza. End of section 46. Recording by Doug Taylor, Squim, Washington.
Section 47 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ron Altman. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8, Section 47. The ending of all Don Quixote's adventures, of how Don Quixote fell sick, and of the will he made, and how he died, by George Santayana. As nothing that is man's can last forever, but all tends ever downwards from its beginning to its end, and above all man's life, and as Don Quixote's enjoyed no special dispensation from heaven to stay its course, its end and close came when he least looked for it. For whether it was of the dejection the thought of his defeat produced, or of heaven's will that so ordered it. A fever settled upon him, and kept him in his bed for 6 days, during which he was often visited by his friends the curate, the bachelor, and the barber, while his good squire Sancho Panza never quitted his bedside. They persuaded that it was grief at finding himself vanquished, and the object of his heart, the liberation and disenchantment of Dulcinea, unattained, that kept him in this state, strove by all the means in their power to cheer him up. The bachelor, bidding him take heart and get up to begin his pastoral life, for which he himself, he said, had already composed an eclogue that would take the shine out of all Sannazaro had ever written, and had bought with his own money 2 famous dogs to guard the flock, one called Barcino, and the other Butran, which a herdsman of Quintanar had sold him. But for all this Don Quixote could not shake off his sadness. His friends called in the doctor, who felt his pulse, and was not very well satisfied with it, and said that in any case it would be well for him to attend to the health of his soul, as that of his body was in a bad way. Don Quixote heard this calmly, but not so his housekeeper, his niece, and his squire, who fell weeping bitterly, as if they had him lying dead before them. The doctor's opinion was that melancholy and depression were bringing him to his end. Don Quixote begged them to leave him to himself, as he had a wish to sleep a little. They obeyed, and he slept at one stretch, as the saying is, more than 6 hours, so that the housekeeper and niece thought he was going to sleep forever. But at the end of that time he woke up, and in a loud voice exclaimed, "Blessed be Almighty God, who has shown me such goodness! In truth, his mercies are boundless, and the sins of men can neither limit them nor keep them back." The niece listened with attention to her uncle's words, and they struck her as more coherent than what usually fell from him, at least during his illness, so she asked, "What are you saying, Señor? Has anything strange occurred? What mercies or what sins of men are you talking of?" "The mercies, niece," said Don Quixote, "are those that God has this moment shown me, and with him, as I said, my sins are no impediment to them. My reason is now free and clear, rid of the dark shadows of ignorance that my unhappy constant study of those detestable books of chivalry cast over it. Now I see through their absurdities and deceptions, and it only grieves me that this destruction of my illusions has come so late that it leaves me no time to make some amends by reading other books that might be a light to my soul. Niece, I feel myself at the point of death, and I would fain meet it in such a way as to show that my life has not been so ill that I should leave behind me the name of a madman. For though I have been one, I would not that the fact should be made plainer at my death. Call in to me, my dear, my good friends, the curate, the bachelor, Samson Carrasco, and Master Nicholas the barber, for I wish to confess and make my will." But his niece was saved the trouble by the entrance of the 3. The instant Don Quixote saw them, he exclaimed, "Good news for you, good sirs, that I am no longer Don Quixote of La Mancha, but Alonso Quijano, whose way of life won for him the name of good. Now am I the enemy of Amadis of Gaul, and of the whole countless troop of his descendants. Odious to me now are all the profane stories of knight-errantry. Now I perceive my folly, and the peril into which reading them brought me. Now, by God's mercy, schooled into my right senses, I loathe them. When the three heard him speak in this way, they had no doubt whatever that some new craze had taken possession of him. And said Samson, "What, Señor Don Quixote? Now that we have intelligence of the lady Dulcinea being disenchanted, are you taking this line? Now, just as we are on the point of becoming shepherds, to pass our lives singing like princes, are you thinking of turning hermit? Hush, for heaven's sake, be rational, and let's have no more nonsense." "All that nonsense," said Don Quixote, "that until now has been a reality to my hurt, my death will, with heaven's help, turn to my good. I feel, sirs, that I am rapidly drawing near death. A truce to jesting. Let me have a confessor to confess me, and a notary to make my will. For in extremities like this, man must not trifle with his soul. And while the curate is confessing me, let someone, I beg, go for the notary." They looked at one another, wondering at Don Quixote's words. But though uncertain, they were inclined to believe him, and one of the signs by which they came to the conclusion he was dying was this so sudden and complete return to his senses after having been mad. For to the words already quoted he added much more, so well expressed, so devout, and so rational, as to banish all doubt and convince them that he was sound of mind. The curate turned them all out, and left alone with him, confessed him. The bachelor went for the notary, and returned shortly afterwards with him and with Sancho, who, having already learned from the bachelor the condition his master was in, and finding the housekeeper and niece weeping, began to blubber and shed tears. The confession over, the curate came out, saying, "Alonso Quijano the Good is indeed dying, and is indeed in his right mind. We may now go in to him while he makes his will." This news gave a tremendous impulse to the brimming eyes of the housekeeper, niece, and Sancho Panza, his good squire, making the tears burst from their eyes, and a host of sighs from their hearts. For, of a truth, as has been said more than once, whether as plain Alonso Quijano the Good, or as Don Quixote of La Mancha, Don Quixote was always of a gentle disposition, and kindly in all his ways, and hence he was beloved, not only by those of his own house, but by all who knew him. The notary came in with the rest, and as soon as the preamble of the will had been set out, and Don Quixote had commended his soul to God with all the devout formalities that are usual, coming to the bequests, he said, "Item, it is my will that touching certain moneys in the hands of Sancho Panza, whom in my madness I made my squire, inasmuch as between him and me there have been certain accounts and debits and credits, no claim be made against him, nor any account demanded of him in respect of them, but that if anything remain over and above after he has paid himself what I owe him, the balance, which will be but little, shall be his, and much good may it do him. And if, as when I was mad, I had a share in giving him the government of an island, so now that I am in my senses, I could give him that of a kingdom, it should be his. for the simplicity of his character and the fidelity of his conduct deserve it." And then, turning to Sancho, he said, "Forgive me, my friend, that I led thee to seem as mad as myself, making thee fall into the same error I myself fell into, that there were and still are knights errant in the world." "Ah," said Sancho, weeping, "don't die, master, but take my advice and live many years. For the foolishest thing a man can do in this life is to let himself die without rhyme or reason, without anybody killing him, or any hands but melancholy's making an end of him. Come, don't be lazy, but get up from your bed, and let us take to the fields in shepherd's trim, as we agreed. Perhaps behind some bush we shall find the Lady Dulcinea disenchanted, as fine can be. If it be that you are dying of vexation at having been vanquished, lay the blame on me, and say you were overthrown because I had girthed Rosinante badly. Besides, you must have seen in your books of chivalry that it is a common thing for knights to upset one another, and for him who is conquered today to be conqueror tomorrow." "Very true," said Samson, "and good Sancho Panza's view of these cases is quite right." "Sirs, not so fast," said Don Quixote. "In last year's nests there are no birds this year. I was mad, now I am in my senses. I was Don Quixote of La Mancha. I am now, as I said, Alonso Quijano the Good, and may my repentance and sincerity restore me to the esteem you used to have for me. And now let Master Notary proceed. Item, I leave all my property absolutely to Antonia Quijana, my niece, here present, after all has been deducted from the most available portion of it that may be required to satisfy the bequests I have made. And the first disbursement I desire to be made is the payment of the wages I owe for the time my housekeeper has served me, with 20 ducats over and above for a gown. The curate and the bachelor Samson Carrasco, now present, I appoint my executors. Item, it is my wish that if Antonia Quijana, my niece, desires to marry, she shall marry a man of whom it shall be first of all ascertained by information taken that he does not know what books of chivalry are, and if it should be proved that he does, and if in spite of this my niece insists upon marrying him, and does marry him, then she shall forfeit the whole of what I have left her, which my executors shall devote to works of charity as they please. Item, I entreat the aforesaid gentlemen, my executors, that if any happy chance should lead them to discover the author, who is said to have written a history now going about, under the title of Second Part of the Achievements of Don Quixote of La Mancha, they beg of him on my behalf, as earnestly as they can, to forgive me for having been, without intending it, the cause of his writing so many and such monstrous absurdities as he has written in it. For I am leaving the world with a feeling of compunction at having provoked him to write them. With this he closed his will, and a faintness coming over him, he stretched himself out at full length on the bed. All were in a flutter, and made haste to relieve him, and during the 3 days he lived after that, on which he made his will, he fainted away very often. The house was all in confusion, But still the niece ate, and the housekeeper drank, and Sancho Panza enjoyed himself, for inheriting property wipes out or softens down in the air the feeling of grief the dead man might be expected to leave behind him. At last Don Quixote's end came, after he had received all the sacraments, and had in full and forcible terms expressed his detestation of books of chivalry. The notary was there at the time, and he said that in no book of chivalry had he ever read of any knight-errant dying in his bed so calmly and so like a Christian as Don Quixote, who, amid the tears and lamentations of all present, yielded up his spirit, that is to say, died. On perceiving it, the curate begged the notary to bear witness that Alonso Quijano the Good, commonly called Don Quixote of La Mancha, had passed away from this present life and died naturally, and said he desired this testimony in order to remove the possibility of any other author save Cid Hamet Benengeli bringing him to life again falsely and making interminable stories out of his achievements. Such was the end of the ingenious gentleman of La Mancha, whose village Cid Hamet would not indicate precisely, in order to leave all the towns and villages of La Mancha to contend among themselves for the right to adopt him and claim him as a son, as the 7 cities of Greece contended for Homer. The lamentations of Sancho and the niece and housekeeper are omitted here, as well as the new epitaphs upon his tomb. Samson Carrasco, however, put the following: "A doughty gentleman lies here, a stranger all his life to fear, nor in his death could death prevail in that last hour to make him quail. He for the world but little cared, and at his feats the world was scared. A crazy man his life he passed, but in his senses died at last." And said most sage Cid Hamet to his pen, "Rest here, hung up by this brass wire upon this shelf. O my pen, whether of skilful make or clumsy cut I know not, here shalt thou remain long ages hence, unless presumptuous or malignant storytellers take thee down to profane thee. But ere they touch thee warn them, and as best thou canst say to them, Hold off, ye weaklings, hold your hands, adventure it let none, for this enterprise, my lord the king, was meant for me alone. For me alone was Don Quixote born, and I for him. It was his to act, mine to write. We two together make but one, notwithstanding and in spite of that pretended Tordesilesque writer who has ventured or would venture with his great coarse, ill-trimmed ostrich quill to write the achievements of my valiant knight. No burden for his shoulders, nor subject for his frozen wit, whom, if perchance thou shouldst come to know him, thou shalt warn to leave at rest where they lie the weary mouldering bones of Don Quixote, and not to attempt to carry him off in opposition to all the privileges of death to old Castile, making him rise from the grave where in reality and truth he lies stretched at full length, powerless to make any third expedition or new sally. For the two that he has already made, so much to the enjoyment and approval of everybody to whom they have become known, in this as well as in foreign countries, are quite sufficient for the purpose of turning into ridicule the whole of those made by the whole set of the knights errant. And so doing shalt thou discharge thy Christian calling, giving good counsel to one that bears ill will to thee. And I shall remain satisfied and proud to have been the first who has ever enjoyed the fruit of his writings as fully as he could desire. For my desire has been no other than to deliver over to the detestation of mankind the false and foolish tales of the books of chivalry, which, thanks to that of my true Don Quixote, are even now tottering, and doubtless doomed to fall forever. Farewell. End of section 47. Recording by Ron Altman. End of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 8.